She had stopped sleeping well 3 years ago, and she had stopped telling Marcus about it long before that. Every morning, Diane Reed was up before 6. Not because she was naturally an early riser, and not because she had somewhere urgent to be at that hour. She got up early because lying in the quiet dark beside a man who somehow felt further away with each passing morning had become harder than simply getting up and doing something with her restless hands. So she would slide out from under the covers without making a sound, and she would move through the apartment in her socks, and she would go to the kitchen and make coffee and stand at the window and think. The sky over Atlanta changed slowly in those early hours. It went from black to a deep and bruised purple, and then from that purple to a thin, uncertain blue that eventually gave way to something warm and golden near the horizon. Diane had watched that transition hundreds of mornings by now. She found something honest in it that she could not find in many other places. The sky did not pretend to stay the same. It moved and changed and became something new, without apologizing for it. She admired that more than she would have been comfortable admitting out loud. She had been married to Marcus Reed for 6 years. She had loved him longer than that, since their 3rd year of college, when he had appeared in her sociology class and sat down in the empty seat beside her and said, without looking up from his notebook, "If the professor assigns group work, you may want to consider sitting next to someone less interesting next time." She had laughed loud enough that the professor paused mid-sentence and looked out at the room. Marcus had kept his eyes on the table and smiled a small, private smile, and that smile had undone her in a way she had not recovered from quickly. She walked out of that class 2 hours later, having already begun an entirely different chapter of her life. They had been good together in the early years. Not the kind of good that lives only in memory, soft and made golden by distance. They were actually and genuinely good. Marcus was sharp and funny and attentive in a specific way she had not experienced before, and did not expect to find again in another person. He noticed things about her with a consistency that made her feel like the most important person in whatever room they shared. He remembered that she liked the window seat on planes because she liked to watch the land get smaller beneath her, the way everything complicated became simple color and shape from far above. He remembered that she could not eat spicy food on an empty stomach without a headache that would ruin the rest of her afternoon. He remembered that she cried at commercials about dogs finding their way home and soldiers returning to their families, but never once at a movie, because she said movies were too conscious of themselves to sneak up on her the way real life did. He brought her soup when she was sick, the right kind, with the wide flat noodles she had mentioned once in passing, the kind her grandmother made, which meant he had stored that detail somewhere and retrieved it when it was needed. He drove 40 minutes through heavy Atlanta traffic one Tuesday afternoon to deliver a set of fine liner pens she needed for a client presentation she had been panicking about over the phone. She had told him he absolutely did not have to do that. He had appeared at her studio door 35 minutes later, slightly out of breath, set the pens on the desk, kissed the top of her head, and left before she could argue. She kept those pens in her desk drawer for the rest of their marriage. She used them sometimes and thought about who she was when he bought them for her. She had a way of describing her design work that Marcus had once found captivating. She was a freelance graphic designer with her own small studio, and the way she talked about color and composition and the visual logic of a piece that worked had once pulled him into conversations that lasted past midnight. She could explain why a particular shade of warm gray made a viewer feel calm, while a slightly cooler one, of the same lightness, made them feel subtly unsettled, and she described it with the genuine pleasure of someone sharing a secret they were glad to pass on. In the early years, Marcus had asked her questions and remembered the answers and come back to them days later, saying something like, "I was thinking about what you said about contrast," and she had found this intoxicating, to be thought about in absentia by someone who paid that kind of attention. Now she talked about her work, and he said, "That sounds complicated," and reached for his glass. She noticed this with the precision of someone who had been paying very close attention to a very specific person for a very long time. She noticed it without stating it, because she had learned which things were worth stating, and which things accumulated quietly and spoke for themselves in the end. She kept a small notebook in her bag. She had started it years before to write down things Marcus said that she wanted to remember. The childhood memory about his grandmother's cooking, the offhand remark about live jazz, the time he had said he always wanted to see the Atlantic coast in autumn. She had been using this notebook as a kind of map, turning it into a guide for how to love him well. She had never shown it to him. She had thought sometimes about showing it, not to demonstrate the effort but because she thought it might make him understand the texture of her attention. She had not shown it because she was afraid of what it would mean if he did not have a corresponding one somewhere. The reaching had started so quietly that she had not named it for a long time. It began with small absences. Marcus stopped asking about her work with any real curiosity. He would ask at the beginning of dinner, out of habit, "How was your day?" And she would begin to answer, and partway through her second sentence, she would feel his attention move. Not rudely, not deliberately. It simply drifted, the way attention drifts when it has not been disciplined to stay, toward the window behind her, toward the food on his plate, toward his phone lying face down on the table. She would finish what she was saying and he would say "sounds like a lot," and reach for his water glass, and that would be that. She told herself he was tired. Marcus worked demanding hours, and cared about his projects with a seriousness she had always respected. She was a reasonable woman, who loved him, and so she gave him the benefit of every doubt she had for a very long time. But at some point, she could not name the exact season, or the month. She understood that the benefit of the doubt had become the entire architecture of their marriage. She was doing the work of two people, and he was living inside that work, and did not seem to notice the labor of it. She started planning deliberately. She chose restaurants they had loved in their first year, and made reservations without being asked. She researched things Marcus had mentioned in passing, the small offhand wishes people voice when they are not expecting to be remembered. He had said once that he had never heard live jazz at a proper venue, and she found a small club and bought tickets, and put them on the kitchen counter with a note that just said Saturday. She planned a baseball game because he had mentioned missing it. She wore the blue dress he had once told her made her look like someone worth writing a song about. At each of these evenings, Marcus was pleasant and grateful, and present in the bodily sense, and within a week, everything was as it had been. She sat beside him one quiet evening and said, without accusation, that she felt like she was the only person working to keep their marriage alive. She had thought about how to say this for a long time, cutting out anything that would make him feel attacked, because she had learned by then that when Marcus felt cornered, he withdrew into a particular silence that resolved nothing. He heard her. She was certain of that. He took her hands in both of his, and looked at her with real attention, and said she was right. He was sorry. He would do better. He meant it. She could see this, and for several evenings afterward, he came home on time, and put his phone away, and asked questions, and listened to the full answers. Diane felt something tight in her chest finally give. She felt quietly glad, but it came back. It always came back. It returned the same way each time, not dramatically, but in slow accumulation. One evening he was late because of something that could not be helped. The next he was on his laptop until past midnight. The morning after that, his phone was back on the table at breakfast, buzzing, just one email, 1 minute, and Diane would do the quiet, private math of how many days had passed before the slide returned. She called her college friend Helen one evening from the driveway of their building. She had been sitting in the car with the engine off for 20 minutes, unable to make herself go inside. Helen lived in Philadelphia now, with her husband and 2 daughters, and had a way of hearing things that had not yet been spoken. She picked up immediately and said, "What is going on?" Diane said nothing was going on. Helen said, "You sound tired, Dee, not the regular kind, the kind from carrying something heavy for too long without putting it down." Diane laughed and said she was fine. Marriage was hard for everyone, she said. Marcus was a good man. They were going through a slow period. All of this was true, though the slow period had now extended across enough time that it had stopped feeling temporary and had started feeling like the permanent condition of her life. Helen said quietly, "You have always been the one who shows up for everyone. Just make sure someone is showing up for you." She tried talking to Marcus again. She found a different way of saying the same essential thing, and said it quietly and clearly, choosing a Sunday afternoon when they had no plans. Marcus listened. He said he was sorry. He held her hand, and meant what he said. She knew he meant it. And for a little while he did try, and then the trying faded. The same way a resolution fades when nothing structural has changed to support it. She spoke to her mother Carol once, carefully and vaguely. Carol had been married to Diane's father for 39 years, and believed in commitment with a firmness that left little room for complexity. She listened and said, "With love, have you tried being more patient, sweetheart?" Diane nodded into the phone and drove home afterward with a hollow feeling in her chest. She had been patient. She had been patient for so long that patience had stopped feeling like a strength and started feeling like the mechanism by which she was disappearing. Her 32nd birthday arrived on a Thursday in late March. She did not ask Marcus to make anything of it. She was careful about her expectations in that season. She told herself she only wanted something small, a card, a reservation anywhere, any evidence at all that he had thought of her on her own birthday. He forgot. She saw the moment it came back to him. They were both in the bathroom before bed, and in the mirror she caught his reflection and watched his face go still, in the precise way a face goes still when something lands in it unexpectedly. His eyes dropped. He said her name. She said it is okay immediately and kept brushing her teeth. She watched him in the mirror, looking at the back of her head, helpless in a particular way that she recognized and that no longer moved her the way it once had. It was not okay. Not because a forgotten birthday was unforgivable, but because it was not a single event. It was one point on a line that had been drawing itself, quietly and without interruption, for 3 years. She lay in the dark that night and felt something in her go very still, not numb and not broken, still. Like water that has been disturbed again and again, and has finally, simply, stopped moving. In the morning she made breakfast for 2, the way she had done every morning for 6 years. She put his coffee on the counter with 1 sugar and a splash of oat milk, and made toast, and set his plate at his usual spot. When Marcus came downstairs and said good morning and sat down and reached for his phone, Diane stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched the sky change outside. And in the quiet of the kitchen, with the morning light coming through the glass, she asked herself a question she had not been ready to ask before. How much longer can she keep doing this alone? She had no answer yet, but she noticed that the question no longer frightened her, and that absence of fear, she would understand later, was the first quiet signal that something in her was about to change in a way that would change everything. She thought about this often in the early mornings, standing at the kitchen window with her coffee. She thought about the man who had said that thing in the sociology class, who had appeared so clearly in her life and then become, somehow, more difficult to reach with each passing year. She thought about the specific pleasure of being known well, which she had felt in the early years, and which she missed in the way you miss something essential, without always being able to name what it is. Her design work was good during this period, even excellent. She poured into it the excess attention and care that had nowhere else to go. She redesigned the identity for a boutique hotel in Midtown, and the owner cried when she unveiled the final version, and Diane sat across from her in the conference room and felt something that was both genuine pride and a kind of private sorrow, because being seen so well by a client made the contrast more visible rather than less. She started a pro bono project for a small community garden because the brief interested her. She said yes to things that interested her. She had started to understand that saying yes to things that interested her was a way of being fair to herself, of treating herself with at least the same consideration she extended to everyone else by default. She bought a new houseplant one Saturday morning. She had been to the farmer's market alone, which she used to do all the time before she had started organizing her mornings around Marcus's schedule. And on the way back, she stopped at a small shop that sold plants, and found one with thick green leaves, and an uncomplicated confidence about it. And she bought it, without asking anyone's opinion. She put it on the shelf in the living room, where the afternoon light came through, and she tended it with the regularity that plants require, and it thrived, and she noticed every time she passed it that it was thriving, and felt something small and uncomplicated. Satisfaction. Helen told her once, during one of their late-night phone calls, that the best thing about her when they were in college was that she was completely herself all the time. She did not perform, or manage, or calculate. She just was. Helen said, "That girl is still in there. I hear her sometimes when you talk." Diane had laughed and said she hoped Helen was right. She was trying, she said, to find her way back, not to who she had been before Marcus, not to some earlier version that existed before love and its complications, but to herself, to the woman who had all of this alongside the marriage rather than having given all of it to the marriage, and found herself empty when the marriage could not give it back. The early mornings were her own. In those quiet hours before Marcus woke, she stood at the kitchen window and watched the sky change, and drank her coffee, and thought her own thoughts, without filtering them through anyone else's preferences. And slowly, so slowly she almost did not notice it happening, she started to feel like herself again. It was not a dramatic return. It was more like the gradual warming of something that had been cold for a long time. Small, daily, quiet, but real. She thought about Helen's words, and about the sky outside, and about her grandmother's advice from years ago, that a woman's greatest strength was her willingness to endure. She had endured. She had endured with grace and love and genuine effort, but endurance alone was not what she had been made for. She had been made for more than endurance. She had been made for a full and reciprocal life. A life in which she was not the only one tending, not the only one turning things toward the light, not the only one choosing. She set her coffee cup on the counter, and straightened her back, and went to get dressed for the day. She was going to make an appointment. She was going to start taking care of herself. Not instead of loving Marcus. Alongside it. Or perhaps, if it turned out that one could not exist alongside the other, instead of it. But she was done making herself the only person in the equation. The evening Diane decided to stop reaching did not arrive with any warning she recognized at the time. It came on a Tuesday in October. There was no raised voice. There was no slammed door. There was no confrontation, where everything was said at once, and the air felt cleaner afterward. It came in a kitchen that smelled of roasting chicken, and candles that had been burning for 2 hours longer than she had planned, on the evening of their 6th wedding anniversary, in a marriage that Diane had loved with everything she had, and was finally, quietly, learning to stop bleeding for. She had spent the entire day preparing, not just the food, though the food had taken real effort. She had closed her laptop at noon, and driven to the grocery store, and spent 40 careful minutes, choosing everything right. She was making lemon rosemary chicken, a dish she had never made before, but had been saving for the right occasion. Marcus had described his grandmother's cooking once, early in their marriage, in the easy way people describe things they love when they are not thinking about being observed. He had talked about her kitchen, the smells in it on Sunday afternoons, the particular feeling of walking in and being immediately glad. Diane had written it all down in the small notebook she kept in her bag. She had never told him she wrote it down. She had been holding on to it the way you hold something valuable, for the moment that deserves it. She had found the recipe through research, and through a phone call to Marcus's mother, who gave her the ingredients and the method, with a warmth that filled the whole conversation. His mother had said at the end, "He is going to love this, Diane. You take such good care of him." And Diane had said she hoped so, and hung up, and stood in the kitchen for a moment with the phone in her hand thinking, "I hope he knows it. I hope he actually sees it." She cleaned the apartment in the morning. She put fresh towels in the bathroom and moved things on the shelves that had been bothering her. She rearranged the dining table slightly so that the evening light would fall across it. She put out the good plates, the wedding gift plates with the thin gold edge that they almost never used, and she set the silverware carefully on either side. She found 2 candles in the back of a drawer and set them in the holders and lit them at 4 o'clock, 2 hours before Marcus was expected. She looked at what she had made and felt, for a moment, like the woman she had been when she was first falling in love with him, the woman who had not yet understood that loving someone well did not automatically teach them how to love you back. She changed out of her work clothes before she started cooking and put on the dark green dress she had not worn in over a year. She stood in front of the mirror and looked at herself, and smoothed the fabric, and went back to the kitchen, and put the chicken in the oven, and sat at the table, and waited. The apartment was warm, and smelled of rosemary and lemon. Outside, the October city was settling into its golden evening hour, the one where all the light seems to arrive from the horizontal, and makes everything look briefly more significant than usual. At 6:30, her phone buzzed on the counter. "Running late, sorry, be there soon." She turned the oven temperature down and blew out one of the candles so the wax would not burn too low before he arrived. At 7:15, another message. "So sorry, leaving now, traffic is bad." She lit the candle again and refilled her water glass and sat back down. She could hear the restaurant on the next block getting loud with the dinner crowd. She could hear the clock in the hallway. Inside, it was still in the particular way of a space that has been carefully prepared for something and is waiting for that something to arrive. She had loved Marcus Reed for a long time. She had loved him through the easy years, when loving him was effortless, and through the harder years, when it required deliberate choosing, and through the long middle years that were simply the ongoing daily reality of being bound to another person and choosing every morning to stay. She had loved him through his distractions, and his drifting, and his good intentions. But something had been true for a long time now, that she had not let herself see fully. She could not love him back into presence. She could not love him into showing up. A marriage could not be maintained by one person's effort, no matter how much that person loved, no matter how resourceful, or patient, or devoted they were. She had been standing at the construction site alone for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like for both of them to be there with their hands on the same materials. He came through the door at 7:52. She heard his key in the lock, and the familiar sound of his briefcase set down in the hallway, and then his footsteps. And then he appeared in the kitchen doorway, loosening his tie with one hand, slightly out of breath, his face already arranging itself into the expression he used when he had done something he could not fully correct. "Diane, I am so sorry," he said. "There was a contractor call right as I was walking out. It kept going. I could not just end it mid-conversation." He stopped. He had seen the table. He saw the good plates. He saw the candles. One of them burned lower than the other. He saw the small vase with the flowers she had bought that morning, and the 2 sets of silverware placed carefully on either side of 2 place settings. He went quiet for a moment, with the particular quiet of a man who has just understood what he has walked into. "It smells incredible in here," he said. She looked at him for a long and quiet moment. She looked at the tie half undone, and the slight flush in his face from rushing, and the genuine sorrow in his eyes, and she took all of it in with something that was not quite sadness, and not quite resignation, and was closer to a clear and final seeing. She had cooked his grandmother's recipe. She had closed her laptop at noon, and driven to the store and called his mother. She had lit candles at 4 o'clock. And he had come home almost 2 hours late to an anniversary dinner he had not remembered, and she was not even surprised. That was the thing. She was not even surprised. "Your food is warm," she said. "I will fix you a plate." She moved to the oven and set a plate in front of him, and poured water into his glass, and then she looked at the candles. Both burned quite low by now, and she blew them both out. "I am going to go to bed," she said. "I am tired." Marcus said her name. He said, "Wait, please. Could they just sit for a moment?" And she told him quietly that his dinner was good. She had tasted it herself, and that she would talk to him tomorrow. She said it without coldness, without anger, without any emotion at all beyond the specific neutrality of something simply and finally true. She went to the bedroom and changed and lay down and looked at the ceiling. She waited for the familiar hurt she had felt many times before, after evenings that had not gone as she had hoped. She waited for the tightness behind the eyes and the full, heavy ache of disappointed expectation. She waited for it, and it did not come. What came instead was a stillness that went all the way down. Not sadness, not anger, something closer to the feeling that comes at the end of a very long journey, when you finally set down what you have been carrying. Your arms still ache from the effort of it, but your hands are free. In the kitchen, Marcus ate alone. He ate slowly, because the chicken was very good, and because eating slowly at a table set for 2, with blown-out candles, was the only thing he could think to do with the discomfort he did not yet have a name for. He looked at the good plates. He looked at the flowers in the vase. He looked at the chair across from him that was slightly pushed back from the table, the way chairs are when someone has stood up from them. He told himself she was tired. It had been a long week for both of them. She would be fine by morning. He said these things to himself with the practiced ease of someone who has been managing discomfort for long enough that the management has become automatic. He put his plate in the sink and went to the bedroom. She was still on her side. He slid in carefully and said her name softly, and she breathed slowly, and he thought she was asleep. He closed his eyes, and within a reasonable amount of time he was. Diane was not asleep. She was lying in the dark with her hands folded on her chest and her eyes open, and she was not planning anything. For the first time in 3 years, she was lying still in the dark without planning a next move, and the absence of planning felt strange and then, gradually, like breathing. She had made a decision without deciding. It had come in through the back of her, the way real changes do, not through the mind first, but through some deeper place, some part of herself that had been watching and waiting and had finally seen enough. She was going to stop reaching, not as a punishment, not as a strategy. She was going to stop reaching because she had finally, genuinely run out of the kind of energy that reaching required, and because a voice inside her that she had been politely ignoring for a long time had finally gotten loud enough to hear. The voice said, You have been fighting for this marriage alone for 3 years, and it has not worked, and you know what you have to do. You have to stop fighting alone. You have to stop waiting for him to give you permission to exist fully, and start existing." She did not cry. She breathed. Beside her, Marcus slept. Outside, the October city carried on. And in the dark of the bedroom, something ended, and something else, though she did not know it yet, had very quietly begun. By morning, she looked the same as she always had. She made coffee, and moved through the kitchen with her usual efficiency, and said good morning when he came downstairs, and smiled at things that warranted smiling at. She was not cold, and she was not sharp. But the reaching was gone. And in its absence, there was a different kind of quiet. A quiet that was, for the first time in a long time, entirely about her. She thought, in the dark, about the 3 years of trying. She went through them the way you go through a list of things you need to account for, not with bitterness, but with a kind of clear-eyed honesty. The date nights she had planned, the conversations she had initiated, the careful, deliberate ways she had tried to rebuild something that could not be rebuilt by one person's effort alone. She thought about the notebook in her bag, with all the things she had written down that Marcus had said, the small private archive of her attention to him, and she thought, there is no notebook for me. There is no record of someone paying the same quality of attention to me that I have been paying to him. This was not an accusation, it was an observation, and the observation, held clearly in the dark, without the fog of hope or the urgency of hurt, told her something she had been approaching for a long time. She had been living inside an arrangement that was not an arrangement at all, not in the mutual sense. She had been giving to something that was not giving back in the same way, and she had been telling herself for 3 years that this was a temporary condition, that the right conversation, or the right evening, or the right amount of patience would shift things. And tonight, lying still in the dark beside her sleeping husband, she understood that she had been wrong. Not about him, about herself, about what she was willing to accept. She thought about what she had said to Helen once, many months ago, about not wanting to be one of those women who left a good man because marriage was hard. She understood something about that sentence now that she had not understood then. The question was not whether Marcus was a good man. He was a good man. The question was whether being a good man excused you from the work of being a present partner. It did not. And she had been so busy not blaming him that she had failed to require anything of him. She was not going to do that anymore. The decision was quiet and without ceremony. There was no dramatic clarity or sudden relief. There was only the deep, still knowledge of a woman who has finally stopped running from something and turned to face it, and who has found, in the facing of it, that it is not nearly as frightening as the running. By morning she got up and made coffee, and moved through the kitchen, and when Marcus came downstairs and sat down and opened his phone, she looked at him with the ordinary composure of a woman who has made a decision and is no longer at war with it. She answered his questions, and kissed his cheek when he left, and watched him go down the stairs, and then she stood at the kitchen window alone with her coffee, and the sky outside was changing, and for the first time in a long time she watched it change, without thinking about what she needed to do differently tomorrow. Tomorrow, she thought, she was going to do something for herself. She thought, lying in the dark, that she was going to call Dr. Collins in the morning. She had the number in her phone, had had it for weeks, had been carrying it around the way you carry the phone number of someone you are not yet ready to call. She was ready now. She was not going to try to figure out everything alone in the dark anymore. She was going to get help, not because she was broken, because she was worth the help, and because getting the help was a way of taking herself seriously, of treating her own well-being as something that mattered enough to invest in. She closed her eyes. Beside her, Marcus breathed steadily in his sleep. Outside the October city was its usual self, indifferent and alive, and full of its own concerns. She was going to take care of herself, starting tomorrow. She thought, in the morning, that she would call her friend Helen, not from the driveway, from inside, from the kitchen table, in the daylight, like a woman who had decided something and was ready to tell someone who loved her what she had decided. She was going to tell Helen that she had stopped reaching. She was going to say it out loud, to a real person who knew her, and hear herself say it, and let the saying of it make it real in a different way than it was real when she was alone with it in the dark. She was going to do this, and then she was going to look up the number of a therapist she had been thinking about for weeks, and she was going to make an appointment. She was going to start, very simply, and very practically, taking care of herself. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the sky change and felt, for the first time in a long time, like a woman with a plan that was about her own life rather than someone else's. The morning light came through the bedroom window, thin and clear, and Diane lay in it for a moment before getting up. She thought, today is the first day of a different way of living, not a perfect way, not a fixed way, but a way in which she took herself as seriously as she took everyone else, and in which she required of herself the same care she had been extending outward for years, without return. She got up and made coffee, and stood at the window, and watched Atlanta come to life outside, and she thought that whatever happened next, she was going to face it as herself, fully, without the editing, without the managing, just herself. She thought, the reaching was not loving, the reaching was fear wearing love's clothes. Real love was something more settled than that. Real love did not require one person to run to stay in place. Real love was two people walking at the same pace. She had made a decision, and the decision was that she was the most important person in her own life, which was not selfishness but simply truth, and she was going to live accordingly from now on. The first thing Marcus noticed was the silence at dinner, and then the silence in the afternoon, and then the silence in all the spaces he had not known were full of her. Not the absence of words. They still talked, pleasantly enough, about the ordinary things that made up the surface of a shared day. He told her about the Hendricks project, and she told him about a client who had changed her brief at the last minute, and they spoke about whether the weather had finally turned cold enough to call winter rather than late autumn. These conversations happened. They were not strained, but there was something missing from them, something he could not immediately name, and it sat with him in a low and uncertain way, the way a word you have almost remembered sits at the back of the throat. It took him several days to identify what it was. She had stopped drawing him out. Not the small, logistical questions that kept a household running. Those continued. But the real questions had stopped entirely. For as long as he could honestly remember, Diane had been the person who kept the real conversation going. She had asked about the difficult contractor he mentioned once in passing, and circled back to him 2 weeks later unprompted. She had asked about his childhood friend who now worked at his firm, and whether the friendship was different now that they were colleagues. She had asked, with what appeared to be genuine interest, about the project he described as the most architecturally interesting thing he had worked on in years, and had asked follow-up questions over multiple dinner conversations, building a real understanding of why it mattered to him. He had answered all of these questions with the pleasure of someone being listened to well. He had not noticed that someone had to generate the questions first. The questions were gone now. He noticed this definitively on the fourth evening. He was talking about a miscalculation on a project that had required 3 hours of back and forth with the contractor, and he talked for several minutes and then paused, expecting the follow-up that would usually come, and the follow-up did not come. Diane looked at him with warm, genuine attention and said, "That sounds like a long afternoon," and then she took a bite of her food. He filled the silence himself with another sentence, and then another, and realized with a small and uncomfortable surprise that he was carrying the conversation entirely alone. He had done this before, in many conversations, and had not found it uncomfortable before because he had not noticed that someone else was quietly doing the lifting that made it possible. He noticed it now. A week passed, then another. Diane was not cold or withdrawn in any way he could have pointed to if asked. She was warm when warmth was appropriate. She smiled at him in the mornings. She asked about his day. But she was present, the way someone is present when they are at peace with their own company. Not absent, not cold, simply complete in herself, no longer looking to him to fill any space, or provide any particular thing. She moved through their shared apartment like a woman who had found her footing, and the footing had nothing to do with him. He came home one Thursday to find the kitchen empty, and a note on the refrigerator, in her clear handwriting that said, "Leftovers on the second shelf, should be good for 1 or 2 nights." He stood in the kitchen and read the note twice. Then he opened the refrigerator and looked at the container on the second shelf, which was neatly labeled with the date and the contents. It held exactly enough food for one person's dinner. He heated it and ate at the kitchen table alone, and told himself this meant nothing. He started noticing what was not there. She had stopped saving him the good chair, the one near the window in the living room that caught the evening light at exactly the right angle, the chair he had claimed by preference for 3 years, without once thinking about the fact that she had chosen to leave it for him. She had stopped sending him the small afternoon texts, the check-in messages that he had always responded to with brief, distracted replies, sometimes just a thumbs-up emoji because he had been in the middle of something. He had never thanked her for those messages. He had never mentioned that they mattered. He had not known they mattered until they stopped arriving, and he found himself looking at his phone in the afternoon, with a blank kind of waiting that it took him several minutes to understand. One morning she came into the kitchen with a gym bag over her shoulder. He asked where she was going. She said she had joined a gym. She said it easily, without elaboration, in the neutral tone of someone reporting a fact. He said, "Oh, when did you do that?" She said, "A few weeks ago." He had not known. He had lived in the same apartment with this woman, and he had not known she had joined a gym. He had not known she was leaving the apartment in the mornings with a bag and coming back different, quieter, more settled in herself. He turned this over in his mind all day at work, and the turning of it was uncomfortable. Not because joining a gym was significant in itself, but because the fact that she had done it, and he had not known about it, meant that she had a life happening entirely outside his awareness, and the question of how long that had been true was one he was not certain he wanted to answer. His colleague Peter Walsh appeared at his drafting table on a Wednesday afternoon, with 2 coffees, and the expression of someone who has noticed something. They are not going to pretend they have not. Peter was the only person at the firm who could do this without it feeling invasive, because they had known each other for 8 years, and Peter had a quality of attention that Marcus had always respected and occasionally found inconvenient. He set one of the coffees beside Marcus's hand and sat in the spare chair without asking. Marcus said, "Diane is different," before Peter could say anything. Different how? Quieter. More in her own world. She is going to the gym now. She is out more. She seems genuinely fine. Better than fine, actually. But further away at the same time. She has stopped doing things I did not even know she was doing until they stopped. He paused. I brought her flowers last week. She thanked me, and put them in a glass on the windowsill and went back to what she was doing. Peter looked at him steadily. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus nodded. "Is she further away? Or are you noticing for the first time how far away you have been letting her get?" Marcus had no answer for that. He drove home that evening, via a different route than usual, and stopped at a flower stall on the corner near their street. He bought yellow tulips because they were the first thing he saw that looked right. He sat in the car outside their building, with the tulips on the passenger seat, and had a brief and strange moment of uncertainty. He had come home to their apartment thousands of times, and had never once sat in the car outside wondering whether his arrival would be welcome. He went inside. She was in the kitchen when he came through the door. She looked at the tulips and something genuine moved across her face, something warm and real. "They are lovely," she said. "Thank you, Marcus." She found a glass and filled it with water and set them on the windowsill, and then went back to what she had been doing. He had expected something more. He understood this only in the absence of it. He had expected the tulips to open something, to prompt a softening, to produce some signal that he had gotten it right. Instead, she had received them with warmth and moved on, and he was left holding the hollow space between the gesture and the response, beginning to understand that a gesture made from the wrong place could not substitute for what should have been there all along. He set the table for dinner that evening, which he had not done in months. He could not have explained exactly why, except that doing something with his hands felt better than standing still. They ate and talked about manageable things, and afterward he sat on the couch and tried to read, and could not. He set the book on the cushion beside him and looked at the room. The plant on the shelf, the library book on the hallway table, the honeymoon photograph on the kitchen wall. He had walked past these things hundreds of times without seeing them, and now he sat on the couch and saw them one by one, and felt the weight of all the attention he had withheld. That night he lay awake for a long time. The apartment was quiet. Diane was asleep beside him. He looked at the ceiling and thought about Peter's question, and about the gym bag he had not known about, and about the afternoon texts that had stopped arriving. He thought about the Tupperware labeled for one person. He thought about the anniversary dinner with the blown-out candles. He was not a man who spent much time in self-examination. He had built his adult life on forward motion, on the next project, the next deadline, the next accomplishment. He was good at doing, and not particularly good at sitting still with himself. But lying in the dark that night, with all the small and separate things arranging themselves into a shape he could no longer ignore, He stayed still and looked at what was forming. And what was forming was not comfortable. He thought, something has changed. He thought, I do not think it changed by accident. He thought, very quietly, and in the specific way that honest thoughts arrive when you stop moving long enough to hear them. I think she decided something. I think she decided it a while ago, and I am only noticing now because she has stopped doing the things that let me not notice. He did not sleep well. In the morning he was quieter at breakfast than he usually was. Diane moved around the kitchen with her usual ease, poured coffee, set his toast on the counter, moved through the morning the way she had always moved through mornings, with capability and care. She picked up her gym bag from the hallway and said goodbye with a kiss on his cheek and went out the door. And Marcus stood in the kitchen with his coffee and listened to her footsteps going down the stairs. And when the sound of them was gone, he stood in the quiet and felt, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely afraid. Not afraid of a confrontation or an ending. Afraid in the quieter way of a man who has just realized that the most important thing in his life has been slipping, quietly and without drama, for much longer than he had understood, and that the slipping had not stopped, and that he was, so far, the only thing in the equation that had not yet done anything about it. He rinsed his cup and picked up his briefcase and went to work, and all day he thought about Peter's question, and when the afternoon came, he looked at his phone, and there was nothing from her, and that nothing felt like the loudest thing he had heard in years. He started paying attention to the refrigerator, the way he had never paid attention to a refrigerator in his adult life, and he understood that this was strange, but could not stop doing it. The refrigerator had become, in the weeks after the anniversary dinner, a kind of record of the change he was living inside. The containers appeared on the second shelf with their tidy labels and their single-serving portions, and he ate from them alone at the kitchen table, and thought about what they told him about the life that was now being lived in this apartment by a woman who had decided she was going to take care of herself. He was not angry about the containers. He did not know how to explain this, if anyone had asked, but he was not angry. He was something more uncomfortable than angry. He was embarrassed. He was embarrassed in the specific way that comes when you realize you have been taking something for granted that costs someone something to give. She had been feeding him for years, in the practical sense, planning and shopping and cooking, for two as a matter of course, and he had eaten what she made, and said thank you, and moved on, and had never once thought about what it took. And now the single-portion containers were telling him, plainly and without malice, what it took. It took intention. It took choosing to include someone. She was no longer choosing to include him by default, and he could see now, in the absence of that choosing, how consistently and how invisibly she had been making it for years. He talked to an old friend from architecture school named Daniel, who had gone through a divorce 3 years earlier. Marcus called him on a lunch break, and they talked about nothing particular for a while, and then Marcus said, quietly, "Can I ask you something? About the marriage. Before it ended. Was there a point when you knew something was wrong but you kept telling yourself it wasn't?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The whole last 2 years. I kept saying we were in a rough patch and people in rough patches needed to be patient, and things would settle down. And she kept telling me things were not fine, and I kept hearing her say it, and telling myself she was being too sensitive. Right up until the day she sat me down and said she was done. And even then my first thought was that she was overreacting." Marcus said, "How did you miss it for that long?" Daniel said, "I confused her presence with her satisfaction. I thought because she was still there, still in the house, still going through the motions of being in the marriage, that the marriage was okay. It took losing it to understand that you can have someone's presence and not have their well-being at all. They are entirely different things." Marcus thanked him and hung up and sat in the parking lot for a long time before going back to work, and the thing Daniel had said stayed with him. Presence and satisfaction. He had been treating them as the same thing. He had been using her continued presence as evidence that everything was fine. He had not understood until now that her presence was not evidence of satisfaction. It was evidence of commitment, and commitment could be exhausted. He was beginning to understand why. He thought about this on the way home from work, on the longer route he had been taking increasingly, the one that went past the park where people walked their dogs in the evening light. He watched them from the car at a red light, the people and their dogs, the particular ease of creatures who are exactly where they are supposed to be, and he thought, I am not where I am supposed to be, not geographically, inside. I am not the man I was when I married her, and I have not noticed becoming someone else, and it is time to notice. It is past time. He drove home and went inside, and set his briefcase in the closet, and found Diane in the kitchen, and said, "Can we talk tonight, after dinner?" She looked at him, that new careful look, and said, "Sure." And they ate, and cleared the table, and he said, "I think I need to do something different. Not for you. For me. Because I have been someone I do not want to be, and I am ready to stop." She listened. She said, "I think that is a good idea." And that was how it started. That afternoon, sitting at his drafting table, with the pencil still in his hand, and the paper still blank, Marcus made a decision. He was going to ask for help. He was going to find someone to talk to, someone who could help him understand what was happening in him, and not just in the marriage, because the marriage was downstream of him. It was the product of who he was, and who he had been lately was someone he did not particularly want to be. He was going to change that, not by making promises to Diane, by doing the work that change actually required. He looked up the name of a therapist his doctor had recommended once, years ago, and sent an email. He put the pencil down, and looked at the window, and the pale November sky outside, and thought, this is the start of something. He did not know yet what, but something. He was going to start showing up differently. Not because she had asked him to, not as a response to her withdrawal, but because he had seen something clearly, and could not go back to not seeing it. That was the difference between this time and every time before. Diane sat in the waiting room of Dr. Aisha Collins for 11 minutes before her first appointment, and for most of those 11 minutes, she seriously considered leaving. It was not that she was afraid of therapy. She had spoken of it reasonably, and without shame, when friends had needed it, and had been, in principle, entirely supportive of the idea. But she was a woman who had always been, in practical terms, the person other people brought things to. She was the listener, the rememberer, the one who showed up. She was not accustomed to being the one who needed someone to show up for her. She had made the appointment 6 weeks before the anniversary dinner. She had made it after a morning, when she had counted, without intending to, the number of times she had cried in the past 2 weeks. The number was 7. She had not known it was 7. She had been doing it in the car, and in the shower, and once very briefly, while chopping vegetables, which she had allowed herself to blame on the onions, and she had been so practiced at containing it, that she had not even noticed she was doing it that much. She sat at her desk that morning and thought, something is not fine. This has not been fine for a while. And she made the appointment. She sat in the waiting room and looked at the plants on the windowsill. There were 3 of them, all different, all obviously healthy and well-tended. The deep particular green of things that are watered and turned and cared for as a matter of consistent habit. Someone tended these. Someone came to this office regularly and noticed what they needed and gave it to them without making a production of it. She looked at them and thought, I would like to be tended like that. I would like someone to notice what I need. She stayed. Dr. Aisha Collins was a woman in her mid-40s with quiet hands and a quality of calm that did not feel manufactured or performed. It was the calm of someone who had spent many years sitting with people in difficult places and had learned that the most useful thing she could offer was the full, unhurried weight of her attention. She sat across from Diane in a room that was warm and quiet and said, "Tell me what brought you in today." Diane opened her mouth intending to give a clear and organized summary of the situation, and instead found herself crying. Not the managed, contained crying she had been doing in cars and showers. Real crying, from somewhere deep and tired, from a place that had been holding itself steady for too long, and had finally been offered a surface it could release against. She sat in the chair and cried, and then talked, and then cried again, and Dr. Collins sat with the full weight of her attention, and did not try to stop either one. She talked about Marcus, and about the reaching, and about the 3 years of date nights planned alone, and conversations initiated alone, and the notebook in her bag, with all the things she had written down that he had said. She talked about the anniversary dinner with the blown-out candles, and the birthday he had forgotten, and about lying in the dark afterward, feeling not hurt, but still, finally still. She talked about the pens, about the 40 minutes in traffic, about the man who had been so attentive that she had believed she would be attentive back forever, without ever having to ask. Dr. Collins listened. When Diane was done, she sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "It sounds like you have been spending a great deal of energy trying to be chosen by your husband. And while you have been doing that, you have had very little energy left over for choosing yourself. Diane looked at her. What does it look like? Dr. Collins asked. When you choose yourself. When you make a decision that has nothing to do with whether he approves of it or whether it fits into what he needs. Diane did not have an answer. She sat with the question for the rest of that week, carrying it the way you carry a stone in your pocket, aware of its weight at unexpected moments. She discovered, over those days, that most of the decisions she had made in the last 3 years had been filtered first through the question of whether they would help or harm the marriage. She had stopped going to book club because Marcus had started coming home earlier that season, and she had not wanted to miss those evenings. She had cut short a weekend trip with her friend Helen because she felt guilty about leaving. She had stopped taking the longer, slower route to her studio in the mornings, the one that went past the botanical garden and took 20 minutes longer, because she was always rushing back to be home in time for dinner. She had been editing herself, consistently and largely invisibly, for 3 years. She had not seen it clearly until Dr. Collins asked her one question. She went back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. What happened across those weeks was not dramatic in the way that people sometimes expect transformation to be. It was quieter than that. It was more like the slow, careful work of learning to see something clearly that you have been looking at from the wrong angle for a very long time. Dr. Collins asked her once about her childhood, not in a reductive way, not in the way of establishing a simple cause and effect chain, but in the way of someone who understood that the stories we carry from childhood become the instructions we follow in adulthood, without realizing we are following them. Diane talked about her mother Carol, who had managed their family's household for 39 years with enormous skill and very little acknowledgement. Carol cooked and cleaned and remembered everything and organized everything and showed up for everything that required showing up for, and she did it all without complaint, and she did it with love. And Diane had watched all of this as a girl and absorbed it as the definition of what a good woman was. She sat in Dr. Collins's office on a Tuesday in November and understood, clearly and slightly vertiginously, that she had been trying to be her mother in a marriage that could not sustain that much one-sided giving, and that the problem was not her mother and was not her marriage, but was the story she had inherited about what love required of a woman and had never thought to question. She rejoined the book club. She texted Grace, who organized it, and Grace replied within 4 minutes, saying, "Come back whenever you are ready. We have been thinking of you." She walked into the bookshop on a Thursday evening, feeling the specific awkwardness of returning to something you have been absent from, but Grace met her at the door and handed her a glass and said, "There she is, pull up a chair," and the awkwardness dissolved in the warmth of the room and the ongoing conversation into which she was absorbed as naturally as a current absorbs something that has been waiting to move. She laughed 3 times that evening, genuine laughing from something that had been compressed and was now released. On the drive home, she noticed the feeling in her chest and identified it, after a moment, as lightness. She had not felt light in a long time. She started going to the gym with real intention. She found a rhythm on the treadmill and built it over weeks, the minutes accumulating, and the running was not pleasant exactly, but it was clean, in a way that very little else was right now. It required something specific of her body, and her body responded, and while that exchange was happening, her mind went quiet, in a way it almost never did anywhere else. She ran until her legs were tired, and her thinking was replaced by breathing and the simple sound of her own footsteps, and she stepped off the machine each time, feeling present in herself in a way she had forgotten was possible. She called Helen on a Sunday afternoon from the kitchen table rather than the driveway, in the easy and uncomplicated way of someone who has something genuine to say. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Helen said at some point, "Dee, you sound different. You sound like yourself." Diane said, "I think I am remembering what that feels like." She started keeping a journal. She wrote in the mornings before Marcus was up, at the kitchen table with her coffee, writing about the book she was reading, and about a client whose work she found genuinely interesting, and about what she was starting to understand about herself. She wrote without editing herself, without the instinct she had developed to manage how she came across. And it was surprising and uncomfortable, and then, gradually, something she looked forward to. She booked a solo weekend in Savannah on a Tuesday afternoon, between client emails, quickly, before she could think too much about it. She looked at the confirmation on the screen and waited for the familiar guilt or uncertainty or the old instinct to check whether the timing was all right with Marcus, whether leaving was selfish. None of that arrived. What arrived was a small and clean sense of rightness. She drove to Savannah on a Friday morning. The drive itself was its own kind of gift. 4 hours of road and her own thoughts and music she chose without anyone else's preferences entering the equation. She arrived in the early afternoon and walked for 3 hours through the old squares under the live oaks with their Spanish moss, and down to the river where the brown water moved wide and slow, and she sat on a bench and watched a pelican standing on a piling with an air of absolute composure. She had dinner alone at a restaurant near the hotel, at a table by the window. She ordered exactly what she wanted without calculating anyone else's preferences. She had a glass of good wine and read 50 pages of her book and tipped generously and walked back to the hotel in the dark and felt, walking those dark streets, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. That night she sat on the small balcony of her room and looked at the Savannah sky, which was a deep blue and very full of stars, more stars than Atlanta ever showed. She sat and waited for the loneliness that she had always assumed would come when she was this far from home. It did not come. What came was a stillness that was full rather than empty, like a room prepared for someone who was welcome and expected. She understood something on that balcony that she had been circling for months. She had been giving Marcus the job of making her feel like she was enough. When he had failed to do that job, consistently and over a long time, she had responded by trying harder to earn it from him. She had made herself more accommodating, more careful, more useful, as though if she could only be the right shape she would finally fit into a space that had nothing to do with her shape. What she had actually needed, all along, was to believe in her own enoughness without requiring him to confirm it. That was not a thing anyone could give you. That was a thing you had to find yourself. She drove home on Sunday afternoon, feeling rested in a real and specific way. When she walked through the door, Marcus was at the kitchen table with papers spread around him. He looked up and said hello, and asked how Savannah was. She said it was beautiful. He nodded and looked back at his papers. She went to the bedroom to unpack, and looked at herself briefly in the mirror above the dresser. She looked rested. She looked like a woman who had recently remembered something important. She looked, she thought, like someone she recognized. She made tea and took it to the back porch and sat with her book and the cool evening air. She did not think about what Marcus might be noticing or what it might mean. She simply sat and read and breathed and felt, for the first time in a very long time, entirely at home in herself. This was not nothing. This was, in fact, everything that she had been trying to get someone else to give her. She had given it to herself instead, and it turned out to be exactly the same thing. She sat in Dr. Collins's office one Tuesday and talked about the notebook. She had brought it with her. Not intentionally, it was just in her bag the way it always was, and when Dr. Collins asked her what she used to love doing, that she had stopped doing, she found herself reaching into her bag and pulling the notebook out and setting it on the table between them. Dr. Collins looked at it. She said, "What is this?" Diane said, "It is a list of things Marcus has said over the years that I wanted to remember." She paused, "so that I could use them to do things he would like." Dr. Collins looked at her. Diane said, "I know." They sat with that for a moment. Then Dr. Collins said, "Do you have a notebook for yourself? A list of things you have said that you want to remember? Things you want and need and love?" Diane said, "No." Dr. Collins said, "What would be in it?" Diane sat with the question for a long time. She thought about the longer route to her studio, the one past the botanical garden. She thought about the book club. She thought about the Sunday afternoon phone calls with Helen that had become monthly and then occasional, as she gave more and more of her weekends to the project of being available. She thought about Savannah, which she had never been to alone, and about all the places she had not been alone. She thought about running, which she had done in college, and had loved with a specific, physical joy, and had stopped doing years ago, for reasons she could not now identify. She thought about the journal she used to keep, before she was married, in which she had written whatever she was thinking, without editing it or managing it for an audience. She thought about all of these things and understood, with a clarity that arrived slowly and then all at once, that she had a whole self that had been sitting in the waiting room of her own life for 3 years, patient and uncomplaining, waiting to be invited back in. After the appointment, she went to a stationery shop and bought a new notebook, a good one, with a cover she actually liked, and paper that felt right under a pen. She took it home, and sat at the kitchen table, and opened it to the first page, and wrote, at the top, "Things I want." She wrote for 45 minutes without stopping, and what came out surprised her with its specificity and its simplicity, and with the fact that none of it required Marcus to provide it. These were things she could give herself. These were things she had already begun to give herself. She simply had not known, until she wrote them down, how many of them there were. She wrote in the journal every morning for a month, and at the end of the month she read back through what she had written, and was surprised by what she found. Not the sadness, which she had expected, but the aliveness underneath it. The thoughts about her work, and about the books she was reading, and about the specific pleasure of a perfectly made cup of tea on a cold morning, and about the way the light looked on the river in Savannah, and about the conversations she had with Grace at book club, that made her feel genuinely engaged with the world. She was alive underneath the sadness. She had been alive all along. She had simply been pouring so much of her life into a direction that did not fill her, that she had not noticed how much life she actually had. She closed the journal, and looked out the kitchen window and thought, there you are. There is the woman I was worried I had lost. She had not been lost. She had been waiting. She thought, sitting on the Savannah balcony, about all the versions of herself she had been in the last 10 years. The college student who had laughed in the sociology class without caring how it sounded. The young designer just starting out, working late, and loving it. Building something for herself out of pure enthusiasm and skill. The woman who had fallen in love with Marcus Reed and decided, with her whole self, to build a life with him. And the woman of the past 3 years, who had been quietly and consistently giving pieces of herself away, in an attempt to keep someone close who was already beside her. She had been all of these women. She was still all of these women. The versions had not replaced each other. They existed in layers, and the ones that had been covered were still there, waiting. She was going to uncover them. She was going to let them breathe again. She was going to be all of herself, and she was going to be that person in her marriage, or she was going to be that person instead of it, but she was going to be that person. Starting now. Starting with this balcony and this sky, and this particular and specific evening that belonged entirely to her. Marcus came home on a Wednesday evening to find the back porch light on, and Diane's laughter coming through the screen door. He stood in the kitchen with his briefcase still in his hand, and listened. She was on the phone. He could hear the shape of the conversation without the words, the rhythm of it, the pauses, the way her voice rose and then settled. He could make out the laugh. He knew that laugh in the way that you know things you have lived near for a long time, without necessarily paying attention to them. It was the real one, the unguarded one, the one that happened when she forgot anyone was listening. He had always loved that laugh. He had not thought about it consciously in a very long time, but standing now in the kitchen with his briefcase and his jacket still on, the sound of it arriving through the screen door, he remembered clearly that it was one of the reasons he had turned around in a hallway in college to find the source of it. He set his briefcase down and opened the refrigerator. There was a container on the middle shelf with a note in her handwriting. Chicken from last night, should be good. He took it out and heated it, and sat at the kitchen table with his plate and ate alone. Outside, through the screen door, she was still laughing at something the other person had said. He finished eating, and rinsed his plate, and set it in the rack, and then stood at the counter with nothing particular to do. He did not turn on the television, which was what he would usually have done at this point in the evening, the default motion toward background noise and comfortable absence of thought. He drifted through the apartment instead, slowly, the way you move through a space when you are looking at it, rather than simply moving through it. On the wall above the kitchen table, half framed by the corner of the cabinet above it, was the photograph from their honeymoon in Charleston. He had walked past it hundreds of times in 6 years, and had not truly seen it in what might have been years. He stopped now and looked at it. Someone he could no longer remember had taken it, another couple on the waterfront who had offered, the way people did when they had the time and the inclination. The photograph was of him and Diane in the late afternoon, in the particular gold that exists only in that hour before evening descends properly. She was in a yellow dress. She was looking at the camera. He was looking at her. He had not known the photograph was being taken. He was not performing anything. He was simply looking at his wife, in a yellow dress, in October gold light, present with her. in the straightforward way of someone who does not yet know they will need to remind themselves of this later. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He noticed things in it that he had not noticed before. The way her hand was resting slightly on his arm, the angle of his body toward her, the particular quality of his expression, which was not happiness exactly, but something more specific, interest. The look of someone who is genuinely, fully paying attention. He moved to the living room. The plant on the shelf beside the bookcase was thriving. He had noticed it when Diane first put it there a few months ago, and had thought nothing of it. He looked at it now more carefully. It was healthy in the specific way of things that are consistently cared for. The deep particular green of leaves that receive what they need on a regular schedule. Someone had been tending it with quiet consistency, checking the soil and turning it toward the window when the light moved, and giving it what it needed, without making anything of the giving. He stood looking at it and thought, with an unfocused clarity, that this was what she had been doing for their marriage for years. She had been the one who checked. She had been the one who turned things toward the light. He went to the bookcase and stood in front of it. He looked at the shelves with the full attention he rarely brought to anything in his own home. The books were arranged by some logic that was clearly Diane's, not alphabetical and not decorative, but by something internal and deliberate that he could sense without being able to name. She could reach for a specific book without searching. She had made this whole wall of books her own, shaped it with her mind and her preferences and her particular way of organizing experience, and he had been living alongside it for 6 years, without seeing it as the active and considered thing it was. He went to the hallway. On the small table where they kept the mail, there was a library book with a worn sticker from the branch 3 blocks away. He picked it up and turned it over and read the back. It sounded like something she would love, a novel about 2 women across a generation, a choice made long ago and its consequences moving through time. He put it back carefully, the same way up, the marked page where it had been. He had not known she was using the library again. He stood in the hallway for a moment, holding the awareness of how many things she had been doing that had been entirely outside his knowledge, and feeling the specific and honest weight of that. He sat on the couch without turning on the television. He looked at the room. Outside, the evening city carried on. Inside, through the screen door, she was quieter now, the conversation winding down. He sat with his hands on his knees and tried to think clearly about what he was actually feeling, which was something he was not practiced at. He was practiced at doing things. He was practiced at solving things. He was not practiced at sitting still with a difficult feeling and simply looking at it without immediately redirecting it into something manageable. He thought about the last time he had asked Diane about her work in a way that showed he genuinely wanted the answer. He tried to locate a specific memory and found that he could not. He thought about the last time he had planned an evening for both of them, chosen a place, and made the reservation himself, and told her what to wear. He could not place that either. He thought about the last time he had laughed with her from somewhere real, the involuntary kind that arrives before you have a chance to decide to laugh. And the most recent memory he could locate with any confidence was from more than 2 years ago. He got up and stood at the screen door and looked out through it. He could see her in the chair at the far end of the porch, feet tucked up beside her, phone pressed to her ear. Her face turned out toward the garden where the evening had settled into the specific blue that exists for only 20 minutes between late afternoon and proper dark. She was not aware of him. Her face was completely open, in the way that faces are, when they do not know they are being watched. She was in the middle of something she found funny, and the laugh came again, easy and real, and entirely uncalculated. The laugh of a woman who has found something to be glad about, and is being glad about it without reserve. She looked happy. Not happy in the surface way of someone having a pleasant evening. Happy in a settled, deeper way. The happiness of a woman who has found a source of it inside herself and is no longer dependent on external circumstances to provide it. She looked like someone living fully inside her own life, without waiting for the life to be improved by someone else. She looked like a woman who was doing well, who had decided to do well, who had found a way to do well that had nothing to do with him. He stood at the screen door and let himself feel this clearly, rather than redirecting it. He let it be what it was, which was difficult and important and necessary. He was beginning to understand that the difficulty of it was information. It was telling him something about who he had been and what that had cost. Not what it had cost her, specifically, though it had cost her too. What it had cost him. what he had been depriving himself of by checking out of the most important relationship in his life. He went to bed before she came in. He lay down in the dark and heard her come inside a while later, the quiet movements of someone who had long practiced at moving carefully through a space where another person might be sleeping. She prepared for bed without the overhead light, and she slid in on her side, and she settled with the small and specific sound of someone whose body is pleasantly tired from a day that was lived well. He said nothing. She said nothing. And in the dark, Marcus Reed lay very still and felt the full and specific weight of what it meant to have been careless with something irreplaceable. He thought, I have been living in this apartment, but not in this life. I have been present in the physical sense and absent in every other sense. And she has been carrying everything that my absence left undone, carrying it so well that there was nothing undone on the surface, nothing that required attention or revealed itself as a gap. And now she has stopped carrying things for me and started carrying herself instead, and I am lying in this bed noticing the presence of what I have been missing and understanding, for the first time, with my whole self, and not just the thinking part of it, what it has cost her. He lay in the dark for a long time. The city carried on outside. Diane breathed beside him, steady and untroubled. At some point very late he slept, but not for a long time, and in the morning the feeling was still there, and he was glad it was still there, because it was telling him something he had needed to hear for a long time, and had not been ready to until now. Something would have to change. He understood this without drama or resolution, the way you understand something, when it finally arrives at the level where understanding does something. Not the level of the mind, which can understand anything and do nothing. The level below that. The level where the understanding becomes the person. Something would have to change. And the something would have to be him. He sat on the couch and thought about Peter's question for a long time. Is she further away? Or are you noticing for the first time how far away you have been letting her get? He had not answered Peter when he asked it. He could not answer it in the office, on the spot. But sitting alone in the living room in the quiet of a Wednesday evening, with her laughter on the back porch, and the plant on the shelf, and the honeymoon photograph on the kitchen wall, he tried to answer it honestly, and found that the answer was the second one. She was not further away. She was where she had always been. She was in the apartment, living inside the life they had built, tending the plant, and reading the library books, and going to book club, and calling her friends from the porch in the evening. She had not moved. She had not withdrawn. She had simply stopped moving toward him, stopped reaching across the distance, stopped doing the work of keeping two people in contact when only one of them was doing the reaching. He was the one who had moved. He had moved away, gradually and without noticing, over years. He had moved away in the small and daily sense of someone who stops paying attention, stops reaching back, stops treating the connection between them as something that required his active participation. He had moved away, and she had stretched further and further to maintain the contact between them, until she had simply run out of stretch and had stood still, and the distance that had always been there had finally become visible, because there was no one left to close it. He thought about this for a long time. He thought about the specific labor of what she had been doing, the visible labor of the date nights, and the planned evenings, and the conversations she initiated, and the invisible labor underneath it, the constant and daily choosing to keep reaching for someone who was not reaching back. He thought about what it cost a person to do that for 3 years. He thought about what it cost a person to finally stop. He got up from the couch and went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and stood at the window and looked out at the night. He could see the back porch from where he stood, the edge of it, the porch light making a small warm circle in the dark. She was in the chair. The phone call had ended. She was just sitting now, in the quiet of the October evening, by herself, and she looked from this angle like a woman who was entirely sufficient, who did not need anyone to complete the picture. He stood at the kitchen window and looked at her and thought, I have been the luckiest person in that woman's life, and I have not known it, and she has known it for years, and has been waiting for me to understand it too. He was beginning to understand it now. He was not sure it was not too late, but he was beginning. He lay in the bed in the dark and thought about what it would take to become the man in the photograph again. Not the specific man, not the 28-year-old with the honeymoon tan and the uncomplicated certainty, but the quality that man had, the specific quality of full attention, of being completely present with the person beside him. He thought about whether that quality could be reclaimed after years of neglect, He thought it could. He thought it was like a muscle that had been unused and was therefore weak, that required deliberate and consistent exercise to regain its strength. He was not certain, but he was willing to try in a way he had not been willing before, because before, he had not understood what the atrophy had cost her. Now he understood. And understanding it changed something in the quality of the willingness. It was no longer the willingness of someone doing a thing because he had been asked. It was the willingness of someone who had finally seen clearly and could not unsee. He thought, in the bed in the dark, about what it would mean to begin, not to change everything at once, not to arrive tomorrow with a plan and a set of resolutions and the urgency of someone who has just had a revelation, but to begin, quietly and consistently, to do the things that actually mattered, to ask real questions, to listen to the full answers, to put the phone in the other room, to come home and go find her rather than going to the couch, to plan things without being asked, to show up in the particular and daily way that love in a long marriage required. These were not dramatic things. They were the plainest possible things, but the plainest possible things, done consistently, over time, were what actually built something. He knew this from architecture. He had known it professionally for years. He was going to know it personally now. He was going to start tomorrow. He was going to start by making her coffee in the morning before she woke up, and leaving it on the counter with no note, no announcement, no request for acknowledgement. Just the coffee, just the small and daily choosing of her. And he was going to do it the morning after that too. He thought about the light in the photograph, the particular October gold that fell on them both in Charleston. And he thought about the quality of his attention in that moment, which was the quality of attention you give to something you are seeing for the first time and cannot look away from. He wanted that quality back. He was going to get it back, not by returning to the beginning, not by pretending the last 3 years had not happened, but by becoming someone who brought that quality of attention to a Tuesday evening, and a kitchen table, and a woman who had been waiting to be seen by him, with that fullness for a long time. She had not stopped being worth seeing. He had stopped seeing. He was going to stop that too. He was going to make her coffee in the morning. He was going to listen to her talk about her work with the attention it deserved. He was going to ask the follow-up question. These were not grand gestures. They were the plainest and most necessary things. And he was going to do them every day until they were simply who he was. She was worth that, at a minimum. She was worth the coffee, and the attention, and the follow-up question. She was worth all of it. He could not concentrate at work the next morning, or the morning after that, or the morning after that. This was new and distinctly uncomfortable. Marcus had always been someone who could compartmentalize with ease, who could leave whatever was difficult at the door of the office and step into the clean and solvable world of his work. Architecture was a discipline of precision, of physical solutions to measurable problems, and it had always provided a kind of refuge for him, a space where effort produced visible and lasting results. He had been good at his work for a long time, partly because he gave it the kind of full attention that he had not, he was beginning to understand with some discomfort, been giving to the rest of his life. He sat at his drafting table on Thursday morning and drew a line and looked at it and erased it. He drew it again and made an adjustment and looked at the adjustment and saw that it had not improved anything. He sat for 11 unaccountable minutes looking at the pale paper in front of him with a pencil in his hand before Peter Walsh appeared at his table with 2 coffees and the expression of a man who has decided to say something and is going to say it. "You look," Peter said, "like someone who has been told bad news and has spent the last several days convincing himself it is not as bad as it is." He set one of the coffees beside Marcus's hand and sat in the spare chair without being invited. Marcus set the pencil down. He thought briefly about deflecting. He had a smooth and practiced version of "I am fine," just a lot on my mind that had worked reliably in most situations. He looked at Peter, who had worked beside him for 8 years, and had asked him a question 2 weeks ago that Marcus had been carrying in his chest ever since. And he said, "It is Diane." Peter waited. He was good at waiting. Marcus said, "She is different. Not in any way I can point to directly. She is warm. She is doing things she enjoys. She seems genuinely fine. Better than fine, actually. But she is further away at the same time. She has stopped doing things I did not even know she was doing, until they stopped." He paused. "I brought her flowers last week. She thanked me, and put them in a glass, and went back to what she was doing, and I stood there expecting something more, and realized that what I was expecting was for the flowers to fix something, and they do not fix anything. They are just flowers. Peter turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. Then he said, "Can I tell you something about Laura?" Marcus said yes. Peter did not often talk about his marriage in any depth, but when he did, Marcus had learned to pay close attention. 8 years in, Peter said. The kids were small. I was working every hour I had, and then some. And I came home late, and left early, and on weekends I had my laptop open. And Laura had been telling me for the better part of 2 years that things were not okay. She told me clearly. She told me with patience. She told me the way you tell someone when you love them and want to give them the chance to fix it themselves, before you have to do something else. And I heard her each time. I said I was sorry and I meant it, and then I went back to doing exactly what I had been doing. Because the work was there, and the deadline was real, and the easiest story I could tell myself was that she was stressed, and things would settle down. He looked at his coffee. One Saturday morning, she sat across from me at breakfast, after the kids had left for school, and she was very calm. Calm in a way that was different from her usual calm. She said, "Peter, I need you to think about something, and I am going to my sister's for a week, so that you can think about it without me in the room." And she went. She took the kids, and she drove to her sister's, and I sat in the house alone, and I told myself, for the first 3 days, that she was overreacting, that I was not as bad as she was making it sound. And on day 4 I woke up at 3 in the morning, and I lay in the bed we shared, which was large and silent and full of her things, her reading glasses on the nightstand and her book face down on the mattress where she always left it. And I thought, she is not here, and every room in this house is wrong. Not inconvenient, wrong. The way wrong means something necessary is missing. Marcus said nothing. He looked at the coffee in his hand. She came back, Peter said, not because I deserved it, because she decided to give it one more genuine try. And I have not forgotten, for a single day in the 4 years since, what it cost her to make that decision, and what would have been lost if she had made a different one. He paused. What I am saying to you is that flowers are fine. Flowers are not nothing. But what she needs, what Laura needed, what any person who has been telling someone they love, "I need you here," actually needs, is for the someone to ask themselves honestly why they stopped being here, and then to do the work to actually change that. Not for a week, actually change it. Marcus drove home that evening with his window down and the November air coming through cold and clear. He stopped at the florist on the corner near their street and stood at the small outdoor display for longer than was strictly necessary, looking at the things in the buckets, the seasonal flowers with their colors, the choices. He finally bought dark red dahlias because they looked deliberate rather than apologetic, and he sat in the car outside their building with them on the passenger seat and thought about what Peter had said, and about the woman on the back porch who had been laughing without him, and about the honeymoon photograph, and about the man in that photograph who had been looking at his wife in gold light and not performing anything. He went inside. She thanked him for the dahlias. She put them in the good vase, the one that usually lived in the cabinet, and she set it on the kitchen table and said they were beautiful. She was warm about it, in the genuine, uncomplicated way she had always been warm about things he did for her. And then she went back to what she had been doing. He helped make dinner. He cleaned up afterward, without being asked or thanked. He did these things not as gestures toward some expected response, but as practice, as the beginning of something he did not yet fully understand, but was beginning to see the shape of. At 11 that night he lay in bed with the screen of his phone turned low, and searched things he would not have admitted to searching. He read pieces about emotional presence in marriage, and about what it meant when one partner withdraws, and what the withdrawal was usually a response to. He recognized himself in the descriptions with a clarity that was uncomfortable, in a way that did not allow for easy dismissal or reframing. He turned the screen off and set the phone face down and looked at the ceiling. He thought about the night they met. She had laughed at something he said, without caring how it sounded, openly and completely, and he had turned around because the sound of it was irresistible. The sound of someone being fully themselves without managing it for an audience. He thought about the first apartment, arguing about where to put the bookshelf, both of them completely committed to their positions, and laughing at themselves for it. The arguing and the laughing being the same thing, really, the same energy, two people fully alive inside the same small life. He thought about their wedding, and the way her hands had been cool and trembling when he took them at the altar, and how he had felt in that moment, like a man who understood exactly what mattered, and exactly what he was agreeing to spend the rest of his life protecting. When had he stopped protecting it? He could not find the moment. This was what made it harder rather than easier. There was no decision he had made, no morning when he had chosen to be less present. It had happened the way quiet things happen, in the margins of days, in the spaces between full attention, until the spaces had become larger than the attention, and the accumulation had become something he was living inside, without having consciously entered it, and by the time it was visible, Diane had already been living inside it for years. He got up at 2 in the morning. He went to the kitchen and made tea, something he almost never did, and sat at the table in the dark. He did not turn on the overhead light. He sat in the pale light coming through the window from the street and looked at the honeymoon photograph on the wall, barely visible in the dark, just the shape of two people in a frame, with all the gold light gone out of it. He thought about Peter's wife deciding to give it one more genuine try. He thought about what one more genuine try required of her. What it required of her to pack a bag and drive to her sister's, and sit with the uncertainty of whether anything would actually change. He thought about Diane in therapy. He thought about Diane alone, in Savannah, sitting on a balcony looking at stars and not feeling lonely. He thought about the woman who had stopped reaching and had found, in the stopping, something she had been missing. And at 2 in the morning, in the kitchen of the home she had made, Marcus Reed admitted something he had not been ready to admit before. He was afraid. Not of losing her in the dramatic sense, not of a confrontation or an ending. He was afraid in the quieter and more specific way of a man who has realized that the person he loves is no longer waiting for him to change, and that this was not a punishment she was delivering, but a natural result of something he had done. He was afraid of what it said about him, that he had let it go this far. He was afraid that he had done real damage. He was afraid, most specifically, and most honestly, that he deserved to have. He went back to bed. He lay beside her in the dark, and closed his eyes and thought, I have to become the man in the photograph. I have to find out whether I am still capable of being that man, or whether I have drifted so far from him that the distance cannot be crossed. And I have to find out before it is too late for the answer to matter to anyone but me. Peter had said something else that stayed with Marcus, something small that he had not thought was the important part until later. Peter had said, the first time Laura told me she was lonely, I thought she was telling me something about herself, her emotional state, her needs, the particular sensitivity that made her feel things more than I did. I did not understand that she was telling me something about me, about what I had become to her and in our marriage. I thought her loneliness was her problem to solve. It was years before I understood that it was also mine. Marcus thought about this at his drafting table on Friday morning, with his pencil untouched and his paper blank. He had been thinking about it for the past 3 days. He had been thinking about all the times Diane had told him she was lonely, and all the times he had understood it as a statement about her inner life, rather than a statement about his behavior. She was sensitive, he had told himself. She was an introvert who needed a lot of connection. She was going through a difficult period. He had translated her loneliness into something that had nothing to do with him, something internal and personal that she needed to manage. And he had moved on, and continued doing exactly what he had been doing, because he had not understood that what she was actually saying was, you are not here. I need you to be here, and you are not. He understood now. He left work at 4 that afternoon, which he almost never did, and he drove to the botanical garden that was on his way home, and had a membership he had almost never used. He walked through the garden alone in the late afternoon, the November light slanting low through the remaining trees, and he thought about what it would take to actually change. Not to change for 2 weeks, not to make adjustments that would fade when the feeling of urgency faded. To actually change, structurally, in the way that would not dissolve the next time he was tired, or busy, or distracted. He thought, it would take understanding why I stopped. It would take understanding what happened in me, not just in the marriage, that made the drift possible. It would take sitting with someone who could help me see it clearly, because I have been trying to see it alone for weeks, and I keep arriving at the surface of it, and not going further. He sat on a bench in the botanical garden in the November light, and took out his phone, and searched for therapists who specialized in men, and intimacy, and marriage. He found 3 names that looked promising. He sent emails to all 3 of them that evening. Dr. Gregory Webb responded the next morning, with an available appointment the following week. He did not tell Diane. He wanted it to be something he did because he had decided to, not because she knew about it. He thought about what Peter had said about Laura packing a bag, and he thought about what Daniel had said about presence and satisfaction, and he thought about Diane on the porch, and the plant on the shelf, and the honeymoon photograph, and all the accumulated evidence of a life she had been building carefully, with or without him. And he thought, she has not left. She is still here. She has withdrawn her effort from the reaching, but she is still here, in this apartment, in this marriage, which means there is still something. There is still something worth trying for, if he could find it in himself to try in the right way, the structural way, the way that changed something real, rather than just the surface. He was going to find out whether he could. He made the decision there, at the kitchen table, with the cold tea and the street lamp and the photograph on the wall. And when he had made it, he felt the particular settling of someone who has been uncertain for a long time, and has finally chosen a direction, and begun. He drove home from the botanical garden that evening, feeling clearer than he had felt in weeks. He had made the decision. He was going to see someone. He was going to do the work of understanding himself, rather than expecting the understanding to arrive on its own. He was going to stop treating his own inner life as irrelevant, and start treating it as the thing that was, in fact, most relevant to everything else. He thought about what Diane had said, all those times, about feeling lonely, about feeling like she was fighting alone. And he thought about what it would have meant, in those moments, if he had had the self-knowledge to say, I know. I can see what I have been doing. I am going to actually change. Not promise to change. Actually change. He had not had that self-knowledge. He was going to get it now. It was late. It might be too late. But it was not nothing. And he was going to find out. He lay in the bed and thought about Peter's face when he talked about Laura coming home, the particular quality of it. The way a person looks when they are describing something they have not gotten over in the best possible sense. Peter had not gotten over it. He was not supposed to. It was the thing that had changed him, and the changing was ongoing. And the ongoing was the whole point. Marcus wanted that. He wanted to be that man. The man who was still moved by it 4 years later. Still aware of what it had cost. Still choosing deliberately. He was going to become that man. He was going to start now, tonight. By lying here and letting himself feel the full weight of what was at stake, without flinching from it, without redirecting it into something easier. He was going to feel it and keep feeling it until the feeling became his. He was going to become the man who knew what this cost and valued it accordingly. He was going to start tomorrow morning. He was going to start by making coffee and leaving it where she would find it. He asked her to go for a walk on a Sunday morning, and she said sure, without any particular hesitation, and he got his jacket and his shoes, and felt the specific nervousness of someone walking toward a conversation they cannot take back. It was a cold morning in November, the kind of bright cold that existed in Atlanta only in this season, a light that was strong without warmth, arriving at a low angle that turned the tops of buildings pale gold, and made the bare trees look deliberate, architectural, like the bones of something that would be full and green again, in a few months, if you gave it time. They walked the familiar route to Piedmont Park, mostly in quiet, which was not uncomfortable. Marcus pointed out things as they went, a dog being walked by what appeared to be a 9-year-old, who had significantly overestimated his own strength, a sandwich board outside a coffee shop with a pun on it, that neither of them parsed until half a block after they had passed it, and when it landed he said it out loud, and she smiled. He was not performing. He was simply being in the street with her on a Sunday morning, the way they had been in streets together hundreds of times, only now paying attention to it. There was a bench near the eastern edge of the park, under an oak tree that had lost most of its leaves, and stood in its particular November bareness with a kind of dignity. He moved toward it and she followed without comment, and they sat side by side looking out at the park. A woman was throwing a ball for a retriever that kept finding better things to do with it than bring it back. 2 children in bright jackets were building something elaborate in the dead leaves. Marcus watched them for a moment. They were negotiating the whole time, disagreeing about every aspect of the thing they were building together, and their disagreement was fierce, and their partnership was fundamental, and they did not seem to understand that these 2 things were related. He opened his mouth to say what he had come to say, and then did not. He tried again and stopped. On his 3rd attempt, he said it. I have been a terrible husband, he said. Not in the way that sounds dramatic when someone says it. He said it quietly, plainly, in the tone of someone who has looked at a thing long enough that naming it no longer requires preparation, not in any single obvious way, in the accumulating way, the way that is harder to see from the inside because it does not announce itself as it goes. I have been here physically, consistently, and I have not been present in the ways that actually mattered. I have let you carry things that were supposed to belong to both of us, and I told myself it was fine, because you were managing so well, and because the marriage was still running, and I confused the running with the health of it. He stopped. The cold air moved around them. Diane was looking out at the park, at the woman and the reluctant retriever, and she did not speak immediately, and he was grateful for that. Then she turned to him. Her face was open and honest, not arranged for his comfort, not softened to make this easier than it should be. Just her face, as it actually was. She said, "Do you know what made it so hard? Not the forgetting, not the late arrivals. Not any specific thing you did or did not do, though I could name all of them in order. What made it hard was telling you that I was lonely and watching you actually hear it, watching you hold it and be sorry and mean the being sorry, and then watching the sorry dissolve, and then telling you again. After enough cycles of that, you stop being hurt and start being tired. And after enough tired, you start to wonder whether the problem is that he does not understand, or whether the problem is that he understands and it still does not hold." He said, "You are right. I heard you each time and I felt it each time, and I promised each time, and then nothing structural changed, because I did not do the work underneath the promise. I changed the behavior briefly, and then I drifted back, because drifting back was easier, and because nothing about me had actually shifted. I was relying on the feeling of being sorry to do the work that only actual change can do." She said, "Yes," and said it simply, without additional weight, because it was what was true, and it did not need decoration. He said, "I know I cannot take back the 3 years. I know I cannot give back the anniversary dinner or the birthday or the hundreds of conversations I let die before they became real. I cannot take any of that back, but I have been in therapy for the past several weeks. My own, not couples, just me sitting with someone and trying to understand how I got here. And I am beginning to understand things about myself that explain how I got here, even though they do not excuse it. And I want to try to do something different that is actually different, not for 2 weeks, something real." She said, "Marcus, I have heard you say you will try before. I know you have. And I believed you every time. That was the hard part. I always believed you because I could hear that you meant it. And then it dissolved. I know." She looked out at the park again for a moment. The children had finished their structure and were now standing back to assess it, with their heads tilted at exactly the same angle. Then she turned back to him and said, "I am not angry anymore. I want you to know that. I have done a lot of work in the past several months, and the anger has moved through me, and what is on the other side of it is more like clarity. I can see things clearly that were blurry before." He asked what she saw. She said, "I see that I was making myself responsible for the quality of your attention. I kept thinking that if I planned better, or communicated differently, or was easier to be around, something would shift in you. All I was actually doing was taking on your share of the work in addition to mine. I was managing your engagement with our marriage because I was afraid that without my management, you would not engage at all. And I was right. That is what happened. When I stopped managing it, you noticed. But I cannot go back to managing it. I cannot be the person who keeps both of us in this marriage. That is not what a marriage is." He said, "I understand that now. I understand what you were doing and what it cost you. I do not want to take what you are giving me right now for granted. I do not want to hear it and go home and let it dissolve the way things have dissolved before." She said, "Are you going to leave?" She looked at him with a steadiness that was not hard and not soft, but simply direct. She said, "I have not decided anything. I am not standing somewhere looking at an exit, but I am not going back to the way things were. I know my own worth now in a way I did not a year ago. I know what I bring and what I deserve, and I will not spend another 3 years being the only person holding something together that is supposed to be held by two." He said, "What does forward look like?" She said, "I do not know exactly, but I will know it when I see it, and so will you." She paused. "If you want to try, then try. Actually try. Do not tell me you will try. Just try and let me see it." He said, "I want that. I want to try for that." She said simply, "Then try." She stood up and put her hands in her pockets and started walking back toward home, and he got up and walked beside her. They did not say much on the way back. The cold morning moved around them, and their breath made small clouds in the air. Between them and a flock of starlings crossed the pale sky in a formation that shifted and reconfigured and never resolved into anything nameable. He was aware of her beside him as a specific person, Diane, who had laughed in a sociology class and cried at their wedding, and kept a small notebook in her bag with things he had said, who had tried for 3 years to reach him and then, instead of leaving, had decided to find herself, and had done it with a thoroughness and a grace that he had only seen from the wrong side of a screen door. At the building door he reached past her to hold it open. She stepped through, and he followed her up the stairs, and in the kitchen, she put the kettle on, without being asked, and handed him a mug when it was done, and they stood in the kitchen, in the pale November light, and drank their tea, and the silence between them was the most honest thing that had been in that kitchen in a very long time. It was not a resolution, it was not a restoration of what had been, it was the beginning of something that would require more from him than anything had required in years. He understood this. He understood it in the specific, non-verbal way of someone who has finally heard something at the level where hearing does something. And for the first time in a very long time, instead of finding a way to make the understanding easier than it was, he simply stood in it. They walked home from the park in a quiet that was different from the quiet of the walk to the park. On the way there, the quiet had been the quiet of something not yet begun. On the way home, it was the quiet of two people who have said something true and are now living inside the truth of it, feeling its weight, beginning to understand what it asks of them. He thought about what she had said on the bench. She had said, "If we move forward differently." Actually differently. He had heard this as a statement about the future, about what would be required. But walking beside her now, he understood it also as a statement about the past, about what had not worked and would not work again. She was not asking for improvement. She was asking for transformation. There was a difference, and she knew the difference. And she was not going to accept improvement in the place of transformation again. He thought about whether he was capable of transformation. He thought about this honestly, the way you think about something when you have decided that honesty matters more than comfort. He thought about the times he had tried, and the times the trying had faded, and the ways he had been genuinely surprised each time it faded, as though he had expected it to hold without any structural support. He had been approaching change the way someone approaches a New Year's resolution, with genuine feeling and no preparation, expecting the feeling alone to sustain the doing. He needed to understand himself better than he currently did. He needed to understand why he drifted, what the drift was doing for him, what it was protecting him from, because things that persist have purposes even when the purposes are invisible. He needed help with this. He was willing to admit that. He had started to understand that admitting you need help was not a weakness, but a form of seeing clearly, and seeing clearly was the first thing. At the building door he held it open for her. She walked through, and he followed, and they went up the stairs, in the stairwell light, and in the kitchen, she put the kettle on, and handed him a mug, without a word, and he took it, and stood beside her in the kitchen, and they drank their tea in the pale November light, and said nothing, and the nothing was not empty. It was full of the conversation they had just had, and what it had asked of each of them, and what each of them was now quietly carrying. He thought, she is willing to let me try. She has not decided to leave. She is standing in the kitchen drinking tea with me after a conversation in which she told me the complete truth about what I have done and what she will not accept again, and she is standing here, and that means something. It means she is still willing, and I am not going to waste it. He rinsed his cup when he was done and put it in the rack, carefully, and went to get his jacket, because he had remembered there was something he needed to do. He was going to call Dr. Webb's office and confirm his first appointment. He was going to do it now, before the feeling faded, before the ordinary comfort of the apartment reasserted itself and made the urgency seem less urgent. He made the call from the hallway. He confirmed the appointment. He hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment. Through the kitchen doorway he could see the edge of the kitchen table, where they had just been standing. He could hear Diane moving through the apartment, the particular sounds of her. He thought, this is still possible. It is not too late. But it will require everything I have, and I have to start now. He went back to the kitchen and said, I have an appointment Wednesday afternoon, a therapist, my own. She looked at him from across the kitchen. She said, "Good." That was all, but it was enough. After he made the call and confirmed the appointment with Dr. Webb, he went back to the kitchen and stood for a moment looking at the room. The table where they had just been standing, the mugs in the rack, the plant on the shelf in the living room, the library book on the hallway table. All the evidence of a home she had made, of a life she had maintained with attention and love and a consistency that he had benefited from without acknowledging. He looked at all of it and thought, I am going to be someone who deserves this. Not deserves her, not exactly, because she was not a reward to be earned. But deserves to be in this home, in this life, in this marriage. I am going to do the work to become the man who belongs here, actually belongs here, as a participant, and not just a resident. He turned off the kitchen light and went to find her. She was reading in the living room. He sat in the chair across from her, and they spent the rest of the evening in the comfortable quiet of two people who have said something difficult and are now resting on the other side of it. He did not say anything more. He did not need to. The appointment was made. The direction was chosen. The rest was the work. She watched him from across the kitchen while she drank her tea. She watched him rinse his mug and put it in the rack and dry his hands on the dish towel and hang the dish towel back up, which was not something he usually did. And she thought, he is trying. She could see it in the specific and unannounced quality of it, in the fact that he did it without looking to see whether she had noticed. He had done it because it was the right thing to do, not because someone was watching. She had waited a long time to see this. Not the act itself, not the rinsed mug or the hung-up towel, but the quality underneath the act. The quality of someone choosing to show up, not because they had been asked, but because they had decided that this was who they wanted to be. She was not going to say anything about it tonight. There was nothing to say. There was only the ongoing choosing, and she was going to wait and see whether the choosing held, and she was going to give it the chance it was asking for. They sat for a while after their tea, in the kitchen, in the quiet. Eventually she said she was going to read for a bit, and she went to the living room and picked up her book. He did the dishes, fully, every one of them, the ones from breakfast and the ones from tea, and the things that had been waiting in the rack to be put away. He did them slowly and carefully, and when he was done the kitchen was cleaner than it usually was, and he turned off the light and went to the doorway of the living room and looked at her for a moment, reading in the lamplight, and he thought, I am going to spend the rest of my life being worth this. Being worth her choosing to be here. He was going to be worth it. That was the whole plan. Simple and enormous, and his. Marcus sat in a chair in a small office on Peachtree Road and spent the first 20 minutes of his first session with Dr. Gregory Webb talking about Diane, and then Dr. Webb stopped him. He stopped him gently, with a small raised hand and a slight lean forward. He said, "Tell me about Marcus." Marcus blinked. He had come prepared with an account of the situation, a clear and honest narrative about the marriage and what had happened, and what he was beginning to understand. He had not prepared for the conversation to redirect, in the first 20 minutes, entirely toward him. Dr. Webb was a man of around 60, with a measured voice, and the specific patience of someone who had spent decades sitting with uncomfortable truths without flinching. He waited while Marcus rearranged his thinking. Marcus said, slowly, "I do not know where to start." Dr. Webb said, "Start with the last time you felt genuinely close to another person. Not connected in a practical sense. Close. Someone who actually knew what was happening inside you." Marcus sat with this for longer than felt comfortable. He thought of Peter, but as he began describing the friendship, he heard himself describing the outside of it, the years and the lunches and the easy companionship that existed within clearly defined limits. He could not locate the last time he had told Peter something real about himself, something from the actual interior of his experience rather than its surface. He could not locate the last time he had told anyone something real. Dr. Webb said, "That is worth paying attention to." What came out over the following weeks was not a revelation in the dramatic sense. There was no single buried memory, no identifiable wound around which everything else organized itself. It was more like the gradual excavation of a pattern, a way of existing in the world that Marcus had built so carefully and maintained so consistently that he had not known it was a choice until someone helped him look at it with a different kind of light. His father had been a good man in the way that men of his father's generation and background understood goodness: reliable, consistent, responsible for everything the family needed in material terms. He worked hard, and showed up, and provided, and attended things that required attendance. He was never absent in any of the ways that were visible. He was also never open. He had never, in all the years Marcus was growing up, told Marcus how he was feeling, or asked Marcus how Marcus was feeling, or suggested that the interior life of a person was relevant information to share with the people who loved them. Love in that house was expressed through the accumulation of practical care. It was not expressed through the open, daily, ordinary sharing of inner life that a close relationship required. He had not known he was missing this vocabulary. He had married Diane and had given her enthusiastically and completely everything in the vocabulary he had: the practical attentiveness and the provision and the reliability and the specific, detailed remembering of things she told him. He had not known that her vocabulary required more words. He had not known, because no one had taught him that love had a second language, and that the first language alone was not enough. Understanding this did not excuse anything. Dr. Webb was clear about this, and Marcus was clear about it too. But it did something important. It told him that what had to change was not a specific behavior, but a whole orientation toward intimacy. He had to learn to live differently inside a close relationship, to practice the daily and unglamorous openness that sustained connection required, not because he was in crisis, but because he chose to, because he understood now what the alternative looked like and what it cost. He started with small things because Dr. Webb told him that sustainable change lived in small things consistently done, rather than grand gestures that arrived in clusters and then faded. He made coffee for Diane in the mornings before she was up, leaving it on the counter the way she liked it, and he went to get ready without mentioning what he had done. She found the coffee and said thank you, and he said of course, and the exchange was brief and clean. He did it the next morning, and the one after that. It became, gradually, a small anchor at the beginning of each day, a moment where he had chosen her before the day made its own demands. He asked about her book club with a specific question, one that required that he had actually retained something from a previous conversation. She had mentioned the novel they were reading, something about two sisters, and a choice made long ago. And the following Wednesday before she left, he said, "Does the older sister figure out what she gave up by the end?" She stopped in the hallway doorway and looked at him with an expression that moved through careful and then into warm, and she came back to the table and sat down and told him. She told him about the ending and what she thought of it and what Grace had said that she disagreed with, and he sat with his elbows on the table and listened, without planning what to say next, without waiting for his turn, just listening the way you listen to something that matters. He thought, this is what it looks like. This is what it has always needed to look like. He brought up couples counseling himself. He mentioned it on a Tuesday evening while she was reading, said he had found someone they could see together, said he would like to try it if she was willing. She looked at him over her book with the careful, assessing expression she had now, the one that gave nothing away that had not been earned. She said yes. Their counselor was named Dr. Ann Whitmore. She had an office with 2 chairs set at a slight angle to each other, so that Marcus and Diane were neither directly across from each other, nor side by side but somewhere in between, which felt exactly right. Dr. Whitmore had a very still quality. Nothing she heard appeared to surprise her, and nothing she said appeared to cost her effort. She simply opened the space and allowed what needed to come out, to come out. Diane said things in the first session that Marcus had heard before in different forms, and that he heard differently now, because he had done enough work to be ready to receive them. She said she had felt like a tenant in their marriage, someone paying the rent in full but without any real ownership of the space. She said she had felt invisible. She said that for a long time his comfort had been the temperature of the room that everything else had to adjust to, and that she had been adjusting so consistently, and for so long, that she had stopped knowing what her own temperature was. She said all of this without anger, in the measured, factual tone of someone reporting on things that have moved from present into past, and Marcus sat with his hands in his lap, and did not become defensive, and did not produce the reasonable-sounding responses he had always reached for in moments of discomfort. He had done enough work to recognize the deflections and let them pass. Dr. Whitmore asked Marcus what he heard. He said, "I hear that I made her carry something alone, that was supposed to belong to both of us. I hear that I occupied her life without contributing to it in the ways that actually mattered to her. I hear that she told me she was struggling, and I heard her, and promised, and then didn't change. And after enough cycles of that, the promise itself became part of the injury. He said it plainly, without trying to soften it, or add context that would make him seem less culpable than he was. It was what was true. The couple's sessions continued. His individual sessions continued. Some sessions were harder than others. There were moments in both where old patterns surfaced, where he felt the pull toward the deflections and the reasonable-sounding responses that addressed the surface of things without touching what was underneath. He caught himself each time, or most times, and stopped and tried again from a more honest place. This was not always graceful, but it was consistent, and consistency was, Dr. Webb told him, the only evidence that actually meant anything. He wrote Diane a letter, not because anyone asked him to. He was sitting at the kitchen table one evening with a pen in his hand, for a different reason, and he found himself writing to her, and he let himself keep going. He wrote about the sociology class and the laugh that had stopped him in a hallway. He wrote about the pens, the 40 minutes in traffic, the man who had done that without hesitation, because being thoughtful with her had been the most natural thing in the world, and about where that man had gone, and what he was beginning to understand about why, and what it had cost her in the years he was away from himself. He wrote about the anniversary dinner from his own side of it, the contractor call that had run late, the drive home where he had told himself she was tired, the ease with which he had accepted a comfortable story in place of a true one. He wrote about standing at the screen door watching her laugh without him, and what that had felt like, and what it had finally unlocked. He wrote without asking for anything. Not forgiveness, not another chance. He simply said what was true, and let that be what it was. He put the letter in an envelope, and left it on her pillow, before he left for work. When he came home that evening, she was in the kitchen, and her eyes were slightly pink at the edges, which she did not mention, and he did not mention. They made dinner together, and she was warm with him throughout the evening. Warm in a way that was different from the careful warmth she had been offering for months, something more open in it. After dinner, she reached across the table and moved the salt shaker toward him before he could ask for it, a gesture so small it was nearly invisible, and he noticed it and held it carefully. Weeks became months. His individual sessions continued. The couple's sessions continued. He joined her on morning walks, at first once a week and then more, appearing at the door with his jacket and shoes already on, and she did not seem surprised after the first time. They walked mostly in quiet, and the quiet was good, shared rather than empty. She started leaving the blue-rimmed cup out for him in the mornings, her favorite cup, the one with the small chip on the base she had always said she liked because it had a history. She left it beside the coffee maker without comment, and he used it without comment, and this small unspoken thing was, in its own way, everything. Something was growing between them. It was slow, and it was fragile, and it was nothing like the urgency of the early years, which had been built on discovery and newness. This was different. This was built on earned ground, on the specific and real material of two people who had seen things clearly and were choosing to remain. He was careful not to rush it or to press it toward anything it was not yet ready to be. He let it grow at its own pace, and he showed up for it every morning by doing the small and consistent things, and he let the doing be its own kind of proof. One night in April, he reached over in the dark and took her hand. He did it without planning to, in the particular way of instincts that have been waiting. She was still, and he thought for a moment she was asleep, and then her fingers closed around his, unhurriedly, naturally, the way things settle when they are ready to settle. He lay with her hand in his and thought, this is still being built. This is still fragile, but it is real. And for the first time, it is real because of something I am actually doing. That was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, everything. Dr. Webb asked him once, near the end of a session in February, what he was most afraid of. Marcus said, immediately and without thinking, that I will do everything right for a while and then drift back. That I will put in the work and earn back some of what we had, and then let it slide again, because the urgency has passed. That I am someone who is capable of change, but not capable of sustaining it. Dr. Webb said, and what makes you think that? Marcus said, history. Dr. Webb said, history is evidence of a pattern. Patterns can be changed, but only if you understand why the pattern exists. If you change the behavior without understanding the function it serves, You are likely to return to it when the function reasserts itself. He paused. So, what function did the drifting serve? Marcus sat with this for a long time. Then he said, it was comfortable, not in a pleasant way. In the way that avoidance is comfortable, where you do not have to feel anything difficult if you are always slightly somewhere else. Work was easier than intimacy. Work gave me clear metrics. In intimacy, there are no clear metrics. You never quite know whether you are doing it right. Dr. Webb said, And so I stayed where the metrics were clear, Marcus said. And I told myself Diane was fine, because she seemed fine, because she was managing so well that nothing on the surface looked like it was wrong. And every time she told me it was wrong, I promised to change. Because in that moment, the metrics were clear. The conversation was concrete. I could see exactly what was needed. And then the conversation ended, and the metrics disappeared again, and I drifted back to where the metrics were. Dr. Webb said, So the question is not whether you can change your behavior. The question is whether you can develop a new set of metrics for your intimate life that are as real to you as your professional ones. Marcus said, Yes, that is exactly the question. And they talked about what those metrics might look like, which turned out to be exactly what he had been practicing for the past several months: the coffee on the counter, and the specific questions, and the morning walks, and the letter. Not grand gestures, but consistent, daily, measurable acts of choosing her. The metrics were small, but they were real, and they were his. He drove home after that session, with the particular clarity of someone who has finally understood something they have been working toward for a long time. He drove home and went inside, and Diane was in the living room reading, and he sat in the chair across from her and said, Can I tell you about something I understood today? And she put her book down and said yes, and he told her. Not everything, not the full session, but the part about the metrics, and about work being easier because of the clear feedback, and about what he was trying to learn to do differently. And she listened. She listened the way she had always listened, with her full attention, and when he was done she said, I know. I have always known that about you. I just did not know how to reach the part of you that knew it too. He said, Neither did I. She said, And now. He said, Now I am trying to reach it myself. She looked at him for a moment, and something moved across her face that was not quite a smile, but was warmer than neutral. She picked up her book again, but not before reaching over and touching his arm briefly, once, with the back of her fingers. Then she went back to reading. And he sat in the chair and looked at his hands and felt, quietly and without drama, something that might have been hope. The morning walks became, over the months, one of the things he valued most. Not for any particular reason he could articulate. The walks were not dramatic. They rarely talked about anything important on them. They walked through the neighborhood in the early light with their coffee, and they looked at things and sometimes said something, and sometimes did not. And it was the kind of time that does not accumulate into any particular memory, but that builds, quietly and invisibly, into something solid. He was building something solid. He could feel it. Not the urgency of the early years, not the giddy particular pleasure of a new love. Something more durable than that. The pleasure of being known. The pleasure of knowing. The specific satisfaction of two people who have chosen each other carefully and continue to choose each other every morning, and who know what that choosing has cost and what it is worth. He thought about Dr. Webb's question about the metrics. He thought about it on the morning walks and while making coffee and while lying awake beside Diane listening to her breathe. He thought, the metric is this. The metric is whether she is thriving, whether she is glad to be in this marriage, whether the life they are building together is one in which she is fully herself and fully chosen. That is the metric, and he was beginning to know how to read it. A year later, on an October evening warm enough to sit outside without a jacket, Marcus came home to find Diane already on the back porch with a book in her lap and a glass of wine on the small table beside her. He changed out of his work clothes and poured himself a glass, and came out and settled into the chair across from her, the one he had come to think of as his chair again, though the claiming of it had been gradual and quiet and mutual rather than declared. She was at the end of her book. He could tell by the way she was holding it, loosely, the particular grip of someone reading a final page. He waited. She turned the last page and set the book on the table and said, Grace was completely wrong about the ending. Tell me, he said. And she did. She told him about the older sister who had to make a choice, and what she chose. and why Grace's interpretation of the choice was both textually defensible and completely wrong in spirit. And she said it with the specific pleasure of someone who has an opinion she has been waiting to share with exactly the right person. Somewhere in the middle of explaining why Grace was wrong, she made a comparison to something that had happened at book club the previous month, and the comparison was unexpected and exactly right, and Marcus laughed, genuinely, before he had organized any thought about laughing. And she stopped and looked at him and then laughed herself. And they were both laughing at the porch table in the October evening, for a moment that was brief and entirely unrehearsed. He noticed it. He noticed it with the quality of attention he had spent a year learning to bring to small things, not with analysis, not with the weight of what it meant in the larger narrative of everything they had been through, just with a clean and present awareness of what was actually happening right now. She was laughing at something he had said. He had made her laugh in the real, involuntary way. He did not take particular credit for this. He simply noticed it and was grateful for it, the way you are grateful for warmth when you remember what cold felt like. He thought about where they had been 1 year ago. He thought about the blown-out candles on the anniversary table, and the single-portion containers in the refrigerator, and the evening he had stood at the screen door watching her laugh for someone else on the phone, feeling the specific and earned loneliness of a man who has been standing on the outside of his own life long enough to have stopped understanding how he got there. He thought about the cold park bench in November, and her voice saying I was the only one fighting, and the kitchen at 2 in the morning, with the cold tea, and the street lamp light, and the honeymoon photograph barely visible on the wall. He thought about Peter's story, about Laura packing a bag. He thought about the letter he had left on her pillow, and her eyes slightly pink at the edges when he came home that evening. He thought about everything between that October and this one, and he felt something he had difficulty naming at first, which turned out to be simple when he found it. He felt grateful. Not the surface grateful of someone who has narrowly avoided something bad. The deeper grateful of someone who has been given back something they had not entirely understood they were losing, and who now understood it completely, and who carried that understanding every day as a kind of compass, a constant gentle reminder of what mattered, and what required his attention, and what would require it every day of his life going forward. It had been a year of doing things differently. He would not say he had arrived anywhere final, because Dr. Webb had told him early in their work together that the idea of arriving was itself a trap, that a marriage was not a destination you reached and then stopped moving toward, but a practice you chose every day, and that the choosing was the point, rather than any particular state that the choosing eventually produced. He had understood this intellectually at first, and had come to understand it, in the bone-deep way, that knowledge becomes real only when you have lived inside it long enough. He showed up now, in the specific and daily ways that Diane had needed him to show up for years. Not perfectly. There were evenings when he was tired or distracted in ways he did not fully manage, and she would give him a particular look that was not angry, just honest, and he would recognize himself and come back. The recognizing and the coming back was new. That was, as far as he could tell, the whole thing. Diane was different than she had been before the October. That changed everything. Not different in a way that meant she was someone else. She was still precisely herself, still had the quick particular intelligence, and the generosity, and the laugh that had stopped him in a hallway. But different in the way of someone who has fully arrived at herself, and knows it, and does not plan to leave again. She made her own choices, without filtering them through anyone else's approval. She went to book club, and to the gym, and she called Helen on Sunday afternoons, and she kept the journal on the nightstand, and she traveled when she wanted to travel. She chose him every day, clearly and deliberately, from a place of fullness rather than need. And the difference between those two kinds of choosing was the difference between something fragile and something real. He had dinner with Peter in the spring, and told him some of what the year had looked like. Peter listened with the attention of a man who recognized the terrain. At the end, he said, "You did the hard version." Marcus said, "What do you mean?" Peter said, "You did it while you still had something to save. I learned everything you are describing, eventually, but I learned it alone, paying child support and showing up every other weekend. You learned it across the breakfast table, with her in the room, while she could see you doing it or not doing it, with no grief to hide behind. That is harder, and it is better." Marcus thought about this on the October porch. He thought about what it meant to be doing it with her in the room, to have no comfortable distance to perform from, to have to actually be the thing, rather than want to be the thing. He thought about how that was the specific difficulty of the last year, and also the specific gift of it. He had talked to a younger colleague at the firm recently, a man named Colin, who was newly engaged, and who had said something over lunch about marriage being the easy part after you found the right person. Marcus had looked at him and said, "It is actually the other way around. Finding the right person might be the easy part. Being the person they married is what takes everything." Colin had looked uncertain. Marcus had said, "I do not mean it as a warning. I mean it as the best thing I know. It is the best work I have ever done. I just started it later than I should have." He told Diane this story on the porch, and she listened and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What did he say?" Marcus said, "He asked if it was worth it." She said, "What did you tell him?" He looked at her on the porch. She was sitting in the October evening light with her wine glass and her finished book, completely herself, completely at home, in her own life, choosing to be here with him. He said, "I told him it was the only thing worth it." She looked at him with the warm and knowing expression she had now, the one that had come to replace the careful, measured one she had worn during the year before everything changed. She raised her wine glass slightly, a small and private acknowledgement of the two of them on this porch in this evening, and she smiled. It was the smile from the photograph in the kitchen. He was looking at it now, and not performing anything, and it was exactly the same. He went inside and refilled his glass, and came back out and sat down. She had picked up her book again, but loosely, not reading, just holding it with one hand, while she looked out at the garden where the last of the evening light was finishing. The October city hummed at the right distance beyond the porch railing. An evening bird in the neighbor's trees called once, twice, and then went quiet. The garden went dark. He reached over and took her hand. He did it the way he had been doing things for a year, without calculation, without hesitation, because he wanted to, and it was right, and the time for hesitation had passed a long time ago. Her fingers closed around his, in the practiced and easy way of people who have made this particular habit over many months and chosen to keep it. She said nothing. He said nothing. They sat in the October dark and held hands in the warm evening air, and there was nothing the silence needed to explain. He thought about the man in the honeymoon photograph, the man who had been looking at his wife in gold light, unguarded, present, not performing anything. He had spent years being someone else, and had spent the last year becoming that man again, or becoming a better version of him, one who understood what the looking actually required, and had decided to give it. He thought about all the ways he had almost missed this, not through any dramatic failure, but through the quiet, daily, accumulated failure of someone who had stopped paying attention to the most important thing he had. He had been so close to standing at that screen door forever, so close to watching her build a life that did not need him in it, and telling himself things were fine. He had not missed it. He was here. She was here. Her hand was warm in his in the October dark. The garden was still. The evening bird was quiet. The city carried on in the middle distance, the way cities always do, indifferent and enormous, and full of its own concerns. He thought, "I will not forget what it cost to get here. I will not forget what it asked of her, and what it asked of me, and what it means that we are both sitting on this porch in the dark, holding on. I will remember this tomorrow morning, when I make the coffee, and on Saturday, when we walk, and on Wednesday, when she comes home from book club, and in all the ordinary moments, when it would be easy to let the ordinary feel like not enough. I will remember this, because this is what it actually is. Everything else is maintenance." Her fingers moved slightly in his, a small and unconscious adjustment, the kind your body makes when something feels right and wants to stay that way. He held on, and so did she. And in the October dark, with the garden still, and the city beyond, and the year of earned ground beneath them, that was all it needed to be. He thought about a conversation he had had with Dr. Webb toward the end of their work together, in the spring, when the sessions had become monthly rather than weekly, and the work had shifted from excavation to maintenance. Dr. Webb had asked him what he would tell his younger self, if he could, about love and marriage and what they required. Marcus had thought about it for a long time and then said, "I would tell him that love is easy to feel and hard to sustain, not because it fades exactly, but because sustaining it requires something you have to build deliberately and cannot rely on feeling to provide. I would tell him that the person who will love you best is probably also the person who will reveal, most clearly, where you have not yet done the work on yourself. And I would tell him that this is not a reason to protect yourself from that person. It is a reason to do the work. Dr. Webb had said, and what is the work? Marcus had said, showing up, in the specific and daily way, not heroically, not in crisis moments, in the Tuesday morning, and the Thursday evening, and the Saturday, when nothing in particular is happening, and the presence of someone who loves you is so familiar, it is easy to stop seeing. The work is seeing. The work is making the choice to look at the person beside you, every day, as if they are someone worth paying attention to. Because they are. And if you stop believing that, you are not just failing them, you are failing the most important part of yourself. He thought about this on the October porch. He thought about Tuesday mornings and Thursday evenings and Saturdays, when nothing in particular happened. He thought about how all of those had changed over the past year. Not dramatically, not in any way he could point to and say, there, that is the turning point. They had changed the way things change when someone starts caring for them consistently, which was slowly and quietly and without announcement, and then all at once you looked up and noticed the thing was thriving. He had started caring for it consistently. He had done the work. And the work was ongoing, as he understood now, not a project with an end date, but a practice with no finish line, which was not discouraging but was actually, he had found, the most reassuring thing about it. There was no arrival. There was only the choosing. And he had learned to choose. Diane set her book on the table and looked out at the garden, now fully dark. The last of the wine was in her glass. The October evening had settled around them completely. Somewhere in the distance a church bell was counting out the hour, and they sat and listened to it together. And when it was done, there was only the quiet of the city at night and the sound of their own breathing. She squeezed his hand once, lightly, the way you touch something you trust. He pressed back. She rested her head against the back of the chair and closed her eyes, not sleeping, just resting. And he looked at her in the dark, at the particular and specific reality of her, and thought, I almost missed this. Not dramatically, not through any single failure, but through the accumulation of small ones. He had almost sat on the wrong side of a screen door forever. He had not. He was here, holding her hand in the October dark, and she was here, and this was the life they had made, and were still making, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole thing. He thought about what he would tell his son, if he had a son, or his daughter, about love and what it required. He thought he would not say anything about finding the right person, which was what everyone said, and which was not wrong, but was not the whole thing. He would say, when you find the person, stay awake. Do not let the comfort of them become an excuse to stop paying attention. The most dangerous moment in a love is not the beginning, when everything is urgent and charged and requires your full self. The most dangerous moment is when the love becomes familiar, because familiar is comfortable, and comfortable is where people stop looking. And when you stop looking at the person beside you, you stop seeing them. And when you stop seeing them, you start to lose them, quietly and slowly and without any drama, until one evening you are standing at a screen door listening to your wife laugh on the porch, and understanding for the first time that she is not laughing with you. Stay awake. Keep looking. It is the whole job, and it is worth it every day, she said, eventually, without looking at him, still looking out at the garden. I am glad we are here, she said it simply, in the way you say things that are completely true and need no decoration. He said, I am too, and then they were quiet again. The good kind of quiet, the kind that holds things rather than hiding them. The October night was full around them, the air and the dark and the distant sounds of the city and the neighbor's garden and the particular peace of a porch in autumn. And they sat in all of it together, with their hands in the dark, on the earned and specific ground of a love that had been tested and had held, and there was nothing left to say about it, because there was nothing left to prove. She turned to look at him, her face in the October dark, and she said, I did not know it could feel like this. He said, like what? She said, like enough. Like we are enough. He thought about that for a moment, and then he said, we are. We really are. And she nodded once, slowly, and turned back to look at the garden, and he held her hand in the dark, and the October night held them both.